By the time the fourth picture of my sister filled the screen at my wedding reception, I knew something was wrong. The first one could have been a mistake. The second might have been my mother being sentimental. But then, Brittany appeared at her college graduation. Brittany opening her design studio. Brittany laughing beside my parents on a family vacation, and Brittany posing in a dress I had helped her choose 3 years earlier. I was standing beside my new husband in a ballroom full of people who had come to celebrate us, watching my own wedding slideshow slowly turn into a tribute to my younger sister. When I looked at Mom, she wasn't embarrassed. She was smiling. "Your pictures weren't worth the screen time," she said, loud enough for the people nearest us to hear. Before I could answer, Nathan's hand tightened around mine. He wasn't looking at my mother, he was staring at the screen. "Stop." The DJ froze the image. Nathan pointed past Brittany's shoulder. Behind her, in the bridal suite, our locked document case was sitting open on the table. He turned toward my sister. "How did you get that case open?" Before I tell you what was missing from that case, and why one wedding photo ended up exposing far more than my parents ever intended, I hope you're doing well today. Stay with me, because what happened after that reception changed the way I understood my entire family. And if you enjoy stories where people finally have to answer for the choices they make, subscribe to the channel and stay through the end. For a few seconds, nobody answered Nathan. The ballroom hadn't gone silent exactly. Glasses still touched tables. Someone coughed near the back, and the heating system hummed above us. But the people closest to the dance floor had stopped talking. Brittany stared at the screen, then at Nathan as though she were trying to decide which expression would help her most. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Mom moved before I did. She stepped between Brittany and us with the same irritated look she'd worn all afternoon whenever something didn't happen, according to her schedule. "It's a photograph, Morgan. Don't start turning your wedding into an interrogation." Dad looked toward the DJ. "Keep it going." "No," I said. The word came out calmly. That seemed to bother him more than if I'd raised my voice. I looked at the venue coordinator, a woman named Claire, who had been excellent all day despite several last-minute requests from my mother. "Please stop the slideshow. Don't delete anything. I need the file that's running now, the original file Nathan and I sent you, and whatever messages came with the replacement." Mom's smile vanished. That was the first moment I knew the photograph mattered to her for a reason that had nothing to do with embarrassment. To understand why Nathan recognized the case so quickly, I have to go back less than 24 hours. The afternoon before our wedding, I was at my townhouse packing the last things Nathan and I planned to take with us after the reception. We weren't leaving the country that night, but our passports and travel documents were already together because we were supposed to leave for our honeymoon after the weekend. I had spent most of that Friday answering messages from the florist, confirming transportation, and trying not to think about the fact that my mother had called me 3 times to ask whether Brittany could change her seat at the reception. Then a secure notice from a commercial lender appeared in my email. I recognized the lender's name immediately. My father's company, Ellis Commercial Flooring, had been refinancing debt for months. Dad had mentioned it several times, usually in vague sentences about improving cash flow and giving the company room to breathe. He had never asked me to participate. The message addressed me as a guarantor. I read it twice before opening the attached verification instructions. Then I found my name connected to a continuing guarantee for a refinance of more than $1 million. I hadn't signed one. 4 years earlier, I had helped Dad through a genuine emergency. His company had lost a major contract while several customers were late paying invoices. He had been close to missing payroll. I agreed to guarantee a limited portion of an emergency credit line capped at $150,000. I read every page before signing it. The line was later paid off, and I kept the release paperwork when it closed. I remembered the conversation because of something Dad had told me since I was a teenager. "Your name is worth more than anything you own," he used to say. "Never sign something you haven't read." That lesson was part of the reason I'd ended up working in risk management. So when I saw my name on a new guarantee I had never agreed to, I didn't call Dad first. I called the loan officer. I reached voicemail. I left a short message identifying myself and saying I had received a guarantor verification request for an obligation I had not authorized. Then, I sent an email to the loan officer and the lender's compliance mailbox, stating the same thing in writing and requesting that the transaction be placed on hold pending verification. Nathan came into the kitchen while I was saving copies. "You look like someone just canceled the venue," he said. "Worse." I turned the laptop toward him. He read the first page without speaking. Nathan was a project engineer, not a banker, but he didn't need specialized training to understand one sentence. "You didn't sign this?" "No." "Does your dad know they sent it to you?" "I don't know." Nathan looked at me. "Are you calling him?" "Not tonight." He didn't argue. He knew me well enough to understand the difference between avoiding a confrontation and refusing to have one without facts. "I've already told the lender I didn't authorize it," I said. "There's a written record. If this is a clerical error, I want to know that before I accuse anybody. If it isn't, I want to know exactly what happened before I tell whoever did it what I know." That was how I operated at work. Define the problem. Preserve the record. Don't announce your theory before you have evidence. I wish I could tell you I followed that rule perfectly for the rest of what happened. I didn't. But that Friday afternoon I did. I also checked my credit reports and put freezes and fraud alerts in place. I didn't find any new consumer accounts I didn't recognize, which was reassuring but didn't answer the commercial guarantee problem. By then, the lender's automated system had acknowledged my email. Whatever happened next, I had a timestamp showing I had denied authorization, before anyone in my family knew I was asking questions. Nathan helped me put the hard copy package into a black document case where we were already keeping our passports, copies of our marriage paperwork, and travel documents. The case wasn't anything dramatic. It was a hard-sided locking case I'd owned for years because I hated carrying important paperwork loose in bags. Nathan closed it and tested the latch. "Still sticks. It always sticks. You should replace this thing." After the honeymoon, he locked it and handed me the small key. I tucked it into the zippered pocket of the ivory purse I planned to carry the next day. At the time, that felt like the end of the problem until Monday. The next morning was cold and gray, the kind of Ohio November day that makes 4 in the afternoon feel like evening. The bridal suite was warm enough that everyone kept complaining about the heat while people moved in and out carrying dresses, makeup bags, flowers, garment steamers, coffee, and phones. I opened the case once that morning. I needed to put the lender's paper packet inside, after moving it from my overnight bag. Mom was standing near the mirror when I did it. She glanced toward the envelope. "What's that?" "Bank paperwork." "Today?" "I'm not dealing with it today." She saw the lender's logo. I know that now because of what I learned later. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Dad had been talking about refinancing his company for months. The lender's name wouldn't have meant anything unusual to her. I closed the case, locked it, and put the key back into my purse. Less than an hour later, Mom held out her hand. "Give me that." I looked down. "What?" "The purse. You're about to take pictures. You don't need that hanging off your wrist in every shot. I can put it on the chair. And then someone will move it. Just give it to me." That wasn't suspicious either. It was my wedding morning. People were holding phones, jewelry, bouquets, shoes, safety pins, lipstick, and champagne glasses for each other every 5 minutes. I handed her the purse and followed the photographer into another room. She had it for maybe 20 minutes. Brittany moved through the suite several times during that period. Once, she said she'd left a charger somewhere. Another time, she wanted lipstick. At some point, she went back for a pair of earrings. I noticed none of it. Why would I? She was my sister. That part matters. Brittany and I hadn't spent our entire lives hating each other. There had been resentment, especially as adults, and our parents had always treated us differently. But there had also been real years between us. When she was in college and panicked before an exam, she once called me after midnight and kept me on the phone until almost 3. When I got my first promotion, she showed up at my apartment with cheap champagne and a cake she'd bought on the way over. One of the photographs Nathan and I had chosen for our wedding slideshow showed us as kids, squeezed underneath our parents' dining table, both laughing so hard Brittany's eyes were closed. I had specifically asked for that picture to be included. That morning, I still thought there was a version of my family in which that photograph meant something to everyone. By the reception, it was gone. Nathan and I had sent our completed slideshow to Claire, the coordinator, several days before the wedding. We had reviewed it together. Childhood pictures of both of us. School. Friends. Our first trip together. Our engagement. Our families. Nothing elaborate. So when the screen came on after dinner, and the first unexpected picture of Brittany appeared, I assumed someone had added a few family photos. Then came another, and another. By the time her studio opening appeared, I knew our file had been replaced. I leaned toward Mom. "What did you do?" She barely looked at me. "Made it better. Where is the slideshow Nathan and I sent?" She gave me a small smile. "Morgan, nobody wants to sit through 40 pictures of you standing next to Nathan. It was our wedding slideshow, and Brittany photographs beautifully." I stared at her. Dad heard us and lifted his glass slightly. "Don't make this a thing tonight." Then Mom said it. "Your pictures weren't worth the screen time." It was such a deliberately cruel sentence that for half a second, I forgot about the lender. Then Nathan said, "Stop." The image froze. Brittany was turned slightly toward whoever had taken the picture that morning. She was holding something small near her face, maybe an earring. Behind her, several feet away, sat the black case. Open. I knew how I'd left it. Nathan knew too. Brittany's face changed when he asked how she'd opened it. Not much. Just enough. Her eyes flicked toward Mom before she answered. "I didn't." Nathan pointed at the screen. "The case is open behind you. That doesn't mean I opened it." Mom stepped closer. "This is ridiculous." I looked at Brittany. "Were you in the bridal suite alone?" "I was in and out all morning. So was everyone." Dad made an impatient noise. "Morgan, you have 200 guests out here. That doesn't change the question. You're embarrassing your sister." That sentence was so familiar, I almost laughed. Something happened to me, and somehow my response was the part that endangered Brittany. I turned away from them and found Claire. "Please preserve everything connected to that slideshow." Mom followed me. "Preserve?" "Listen to yourself. The file Nathan and I gave you, the one that's playing, any messages about replacing it." Claire looked uncomfortable but nodded. "I can keep what we received." "Thank you." Dad stepped toward her. "There is no reason to drag the venue into a family misunderstanding." I looked directly at him. There wasn't supposed to be a family misunderstanding. He held my eyes for a moment, and something in his expression went flat. That was another detail I understood differently later. Nathan touched my elbow. "The case." We left the ballroom without announcing anything else. I could feel people watching us, but I wasn't interested in giving Mom a public fight she could spend the next 6 months describing as proof that I had ruined my own wedding. The case was where we'd left it in the secured room off the bridal suite area. It was closed. Locked. I took my purse from the bag where my things had been collected after the ceremony and opened the zippered pocket. The key was still there. Nathan said nothing. I unlocked the case. The latch stuck like it always did. Our passports were inside. The copies of our marriage paperwork were there. The travel folder was there. I moved each item carefully, already knowing what I wasn't seeing. Nathan leaned closer. "Where's the bank envelope?" I checked underneath everything. Then I checked again. Not because I thought it would magically appear, but because I wanted to be completely certain before I said the words out loud. "It was here. Yesterday? This morning." Nathan's jaw tightened. "We should call security." "Not yet. Morgan, I already told the lender I didn't authorize the guarantee. They have it in writing. Whoever took this thinks the paper itself matters more than the record. Which means?" I looked down at the empty space where the packet had been. "It means they don't know I already sent the email." Nathan went still. From the ballroom, muffled music started again. Somebody had apparently decided the reception needed to continue without us. I thought about Mom holding my purse, Brittany moving in and out of the suite, Dad telling the DJ to keep playing the replacement slideshow. Then I thought about the lender's name on that envelope and how Mom had been standing close enough to read it that morning. Nathan closed the case. What do you want to do? I looked at him. First, I want to know who touched this. And then? Then I want to know why. He glanced at the passports, then at the empty space beside them. Whoever had opened our case hadn't taken cash. They hadn't taken identification. They hadn't taken anything that would inconvenience us on the honeymoon. They had taken one envelope, one specific packet. And as I stood there in my wedding dress, listening to my family's party continue through the wall, I understood the first thing that would eventually unravel everything. They hadn't been searching. They had known exactly what they came to take. Nathan wanted to call security before we went back into the ballroom. I understood why. Someone had opened a locked case in a room reserved for the wedding party, removed one specific bank packet, closed the case again, and left everything else untouched. But I also knew that accusing someone before I knew exactly what had happened would give my parents something they had always been very good at using against me, my reaction. If I raised my voice, the story would become that I had caused a scene. If I accused Brittany without proof, the story would become jealousy. So I asked Nathan to give me 10 minutes. Then I found Claire and asked whether there was somewhere private we could talk. She led us to a small lounge near the ballroom offices. I told her I needed my parents and Brittany brought in, but I did not want guests involved. By the time Mom walked through the door, she already looked offended, as though privacy itself were an accusation. Dad came in behind her with Brittany. He closed the door and immediately said, "This has gone far enough." I stayed seated. "I haven't started yet." Mom folded her arms. "Morgan, people are asking where the bride is. They can wait 10 minutes. At your own wedding?" "Yes, at my own wedding." Brittany sat across from me without looking directly at Nathan. I put my purse on the table but left it closed. I didn't show them the key. I didn't tell them yet that the lender packet was gone. I wanted to hear what they would say before they knew exactly what I knew. I looked at Brittany. "Why was my document case open in that picture?" She shook her head. "I told you. I don't know. You were standing 3 feet from it. So it was locked when I left it." Mom let out a tired breath. "This is what I mean. You're taking a photograph and building some conspiracy around it because you're angry about the slideshow." I ignored her and kept my eyes on Brittany. "Did you open the case?" "No." "Did Mom?" "I don't know." "Did Dad?" Dad leaned forward. "Stop interrogating your sister." I turned to him. "Then answer the question." His mouth tightened. That was when Brittany suddenly said, "Fine. Mom wanted your vows." The room changed. Not dramatically. Nobody gasped. Nathan didn't move. But Mom looked at Brittany too quickly. And Brittany immediately looked back at her. "I waited," Brittany continued. "She thought Nathan might want them for the slideshow. Like a surprise. She asked me to see if you had a printed copy." Mom jumped in before I could ask anything else. "It was supposed to be sweet. Obviously that was a mistake." I looked at her. "You wanted my vows." "Yes. So you opened my locked document case." I didn't say that. Brittany just said you asked her to look for them. I asked if she knew where they were. That isn't what she said. Dad slapped one palm against his thigh. "For God's sake, Morgan, listen to yourself. Your mother tried to add something sentimental to your wedding. And now you're acting like somebody broke into Fort Knox." Nathan's jaw tightened beside me, but he said nothing. He knew I didn't need him to fight for me. What I needed was the room to keep talking. I looked back at Brittany. "How did you think my vows were inside the case?" She hesitated. "Because important papers were in there." "How did you know that?" "You had wedding paperwork." "That still doesn't answer me," Mom cut in. "Everybody knew you had important papers in there. You were carrying that ridiculous case around all morning." I hadn't been carrying it around. It had been sitting on a table in the suite most of the day. That distinction seemed small, but I remembered it because the people in front of me were now trying to create a version of the morning that made their access feel ordinary. I asked one final question. "Where is the bank packet?" Brittany frowned. "What bank packet? The envelope that was inside the case?" "I never saw a bank packet." Mom's expression hardened. "And there it is. This was never about the slideshow." "No. The slideshow is how I found out something else happened. You've been waiting for a reason to turn on us since Nathan came into the picture. I almost answered that. Almost. It was exactly the kind of sentence that had pulled me into circular arguments with my mother for years. She would make an accusation about my character. I would defend myself. And suddenly the original question would disappear under 20 minutes of emotional debris. So I didn't take the bait. Where is the bank packet? Mom stared at me. Dad said, there is no bank packet. You don't know that unless you know what was in my case. His eyes met mine for half a second too long. Then he stood. We're done. I stayed seated. You can be done. I'm not. He opened the door. You have guests waiting. And I have a missing document. Mom stood too. You are not going back into that room and accusing your sister in front of everyone. I didn't say I was. You don't need to. Look at what you're doing already. That sentence told me something useful. Mom wasn't worried about whether Brittany had opened my case. She was worried about what other people might think if I asked. I turned to Brittany one last time. If you remember anything else about that case, tell me before I have to learn it from someone else. Her face changed slightly. Not guilt exactly. Fear. Then she followed my parents out. Nathan waited until the door shut before speaking. That story was rehearsed. Maybe not rehearsed. You saw your mom look at her. I did. And your dad just told you there was no bank packet before you told him what was missing. I looked toward the closed door. I noticed that too. We went back into our reception. That was one of the strangest decisions I made that night, and even now I think it was the right one. I had married Nathan less than 6 hours earlier. We had friends who had flown across the country, coworkers who had rearranged schedules, relatives who had driven through cold November rain to be there. My parents had already taken part of the evening from us. I wasn't giving them the rest. Claire had stopped the slideshow completely. The screens were dark when Nathan and I returned. Nobody announced why. The DJ shifted into music. Dinner service continued. And the room slowly started breathing again. Mom spent the next hour performing normalcy with almost athletic determination. She laughed at tables. She hugged relatives. She posed for pictures. Dad talked to one of his longtime employees as though nothing unusual had happened. Brittany stayed close to our parents. I noticed, because I had stopped trying not to notice. Nathan and I danced. We cut the cake. We thanked people. We made it to the end of the reception without another confrontation. But I was no longer experiencing my wedding the same way. Every time Mom touched Brittany's arm, I wondered what they had said before entering that lounge. Every time Dad checked his phone, I wondered whether someone at his company was waiting for news. Every time Brittany looked toward me, I wondered whether she knew exactly what had been in that missing packet, or only that she had been told to remove it. The difference mattered. By the time Nathan and I reached our hotel room, I was exhausted enough that my shoulders hurt from holding myself upright. He loosened his tie while I put my purse on the desk and opened the zippered pocket where I kept the case key. The key was there. I lifted it out and turned it over in my fingers. What? Nathan asked. The zipper. He came closer. I always close this all the way to the corner. I ran my fingertip along the track. It wasn't closed all the way when I opened it tonight. Could you have left it like that? Yes. He waited. But I don't think I did. That was important too. I refused to turn habits into evidence. I could remember where I usually put a key, how I usually closed a zipper, how the purse usually sat in my hand. None of those things proved anybody had touched it. Then Nathan said, "Your mom had that purse during pictures." I know. You handed it to her. For about 20 minutes. We sat down and began building a timeline on my phone. Not theories, times. The photographer had called me out of the bridal suite shortly after 11 in the morning. Mom had taken my purse before I left. Nathan remembered seeing her with it when the family portraits started. One of my bridesmaids had eventually brought the purse back to the suite before lunch. Brittany had gone in and out several times. Somewhere in that same window, the picture with the open case had been taken. I typed each fact into a note and put question marks next to anything based only on memory. Nathan watched me. You're doing work. I'm trying not to do anger. You're allowed to be angry. I know. You're also allowed to admit what happened tonight was awful before you turn it into a spreadsheet. I looked at him. That was one of the reasons I had married him. Nathan rarely mistook competence for invulnerability. My mother replaced our wedding slideshow with pictures of my sister, I said, then told me my pictures weren't worth showing. His face tightened. And somebody opened our case and took the one document I was worried about yesterday. Yes, and I don't know which part hurts more yet. He sat beside me. You don't have to decide tonight. I leaned against him for a while. Then I picked up my phone again. The next morning, Claire sent what she had. She apologized first, which irritated me because none of it had been her fault. Nathan and I had sent our finished slideshow file 4 days before the wedding. Claire still had that email, complete with the attachment and timestamp. She also had the replacement file that had arrived on the wedding day. The replacement had come from Mom. The message said there were a few last-minute family additions. I read the next email twice. Claire had apparently asked whether Nathan and I had approved a replacement because the file was significantly different from what we'd previously submitted. Dad had replied, "Patricia has the final family version. Morgan approved the changes. Please use that one." I handed my phone to Nathan. He read it, then looked at me. "Did you ever tell your dad he could approve slideshow changes for you?" "No." "Did you even know there was another version?" "No." There it was in writing. My parents had not merely added a picture. Mom had supplied a replacement slideshow. Dad had falsely told the venue that I approved it. It wasn't the largest lie I would eventually find, but it was the first one I could prove without interpretation. Claire had also preserved the original file rather than overwriting it. I opened both on my laptop and moved through them side by side. The original began with pictures of Nathan and me separately as children, then our families, then our relationship. The replacement rearranged everything. Several pictures of me were gone. More than a dozen images of Brittany had been added. Some were family photographs where she made sense. Others had nothing to do with Nathan or me. Then I reached the picture I'd mentioned to Nathan months earlier. Brittany and me, under our parents' dining table when we were kids. Gone. I stared at the empty place where it had been in the sequence. Nathan noticed. "That one mattered to you. I chose it. Do you know why they removed it?" "No. But something about that deletion bothered me in a way the glamorous pictures of Brittany hadn't. That old picture didn't make Brittany look bad. It didn't make me look better. It showed us together. Whatever Mom had been trying to create with her replacement slideshow, she hadn't simply wanted more Brittany. She had wanted less Morgan. Later that morning, Claire helped me trace the photograph with the open case. The venue didn't have the original image file, because Mom had already embedded it into the replacement slideshow. But the photo had come from a family thread where guests from the wedding party had been sharing phone pictures during the morning. I contacted the cousin who had taken it. She sounded horrified when I explained why I wanted the original. "I just thought Brittany looked pretty," she said. "She asked me to take one because the light near the window was good." "Do you remember what time?" "Not exactly, but my phone will." She sent me the original. The metadata showed it had been taken late that morning, during the same 20-minute period when Mom had my purse. I enlarged the image on my laptop. The case was clearly open. Brittany stood in the foreground, smiling toward the camera. Behind her, the lid of the case was raised far enough that I could see the pale lining inside. The cousin remembered nothing about it. "She was already in there when I walked in," she told me. I took 2 pictures and left. I didn't even notice the black case. That was exactly what made the photograph useful. It hadn't been staged as evidence. Nobody had been trying to document anything. It had simply caught something in the background that wasn't supposed to matter. On Monday morning, the lender called. Nathan was beside me when I answered, although I put the call on speaker only after confirming with the loan officer that I could. The first thing she told me was that the refinance had not closed. My email from Friday had been picked up by the lender's compliance team, and the transaction had been placed on hold, pending verification of my consent. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Not relief exactly. More like confirmation that I had acted in time. The loan officer explained that the borrower-side closing checklist showed only that independent guarantor verification had been dispatched and was still pending. My father would have been able to see that status because his company was the borrower. He would not have been able to see my denial. That answered a question I hadn't yet asked aloud. Dad could have known the lender had contacted me. He could have known there was a verification package. He just couldn't have known I'd already objected. Then the loan officer said, "There is another issue we need to discuss." I sat straighter. "A guarantee bearing your name and signature is already in the credit file." Nathan looked at me. "What kind of signature?" I asked. "A scanned executed guarantee." "I did not execute a new guarantee." "I understand. That's why the hold remains in place." I asked her to send me copies of every document and communication directly related to my alleged guarantee or consent. I did not ask for the company's full loan file. I didn't have a right to rummage through Dad's financial records simply because my name appeared on one disputed document. What I needed was narrower. What had been represented about me? What had been submitted in my name? And who had submitted it? The loan officer agreed to route the request through compliance. By that afternoon, I also made a formal report documenting that my identifying information and signature appeared to have been used without my authorization. I kept the confirmation with the fraud alerts, credit freeze records, lender emails, and the wedding files. I wasn't expecting anyone to be arrested that day. I wanted a contemporaneous record, showing exactly when I learned what had happened and what I did about it. The copy of the guarantee arrived before dinner. I printed it. Then I sat at my kitchen table with Nathan and read every page. It was worse than the verification notice had suggested. The guarantee I had signed years earlier had been limited. It had a clear cap. It applied to one specific credit facility. This one did not. Its language was broader. Its exposure was larger. And at the end of the document was my name. Below it was a signature. My signature, or something close enough to make my stomach tighten. Nathan leaned over my shoulder. "Could this be from an electronic signing system you forgot about?" "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." I went through my email anyway. I searched the lender's name, Dad's company name, guarantee, refinance, closing, signature, consent. Nothing showed that I had received or signed that document. Then I pulled out the records from the old credit line. I kept important financial papers longer than most people did. It was a professional habit that had annoyed Nathan exactly twice and saved us trouble far more often. The old guarantee was there. I placed it beside the new one. For several seconds, I only compared the signatures. They were very close. Too close. Not because handwriting normally looked similar. Of course, my signature looked like my signature, but both had the same tiny imperfection at the end of my last name. Years earlier, the pen had caught slightly on the paper and created a small upward mark where I normally finished with a smoother line. The same mark appeared on the new document. Sam direction. Sam proportion. Same tiny defect. Nathan saw it when I pointed. "That's not just similar." "No." "What are you thinking?" I stared at the 2 pages. I was careful even then not to call it proof of forgery. I wasn't a handwriting expert. A copied image, scanned signature, electronic reproduction, or something else could create similarities I wasn't qualified to analyze. But I knew one thing. The signature on that new guarantee looked less like something I had written again, and more like something someone had already possessed. And the first place I knew they possessed it was sitting directly in front of me. My old guarantee. The signature on the new guarantee bothered me because it looked familiar in the wrong way. Not familiar because it resembled my handwriting. Familiar because I had seen that exact little upward hook at the end of my last name before, on a document I had signed years earlier when my father still sounded like the person who had taught me never to put my name on something I did not understand. When I was 16, Dad taught me how to balance a checkbook at our kitchen table. Most of my friends learned about money from whatever their parents shouted at them after they overdrew an account. Dad was different. He made me sit down with a calculator, a bank statement, and a yellow legal pad, then showed me how every number had to connect to something real. One afternoon, his friend called and asked him to co-sign paperwork for a piece of equipment. Dad listened for less than a minute before saying, "Send me the documents first." When the man apparently complained, Dad laughed and said, "Friendship doesn't make unread paperwork safe." After he hung up, he tapped the pen against my checkbook register. "Remember this, Morgan. Your name is worth more than anything you own. Never sign something you haven't read." I remembered rolling my eyes because I was 16 and thought he was turning a checking account with $200 in it into a lecture on international finance. But I remembered the sentence. I repeated it to myself the first time I signed an apartment lease, the first time I financed a car, and years later when I bought my townhouse. It was one of those small pieces of my father I had carried into adulthood without realizing how deeply it had settled into me. That was part of what made the new guarantee so difficult to process. If Dad had always been reckless with money, I could have filed him mentally under people who eventually did reckless things. He wasn't. At least not when I was growing up. He had taught me caution, documentation, and the difference between trusting a person and trusting a contract. Then came 2021. Ellis Commercial Flooring had been in business for more than 20 years by then. Dad had built it from a two-man operation into a regional commercial flooring contractor, with crews working offices, schools, medical facilities, and retail projects across central Ohio. It had good years and bad years, but I had never considered it fragile until one spring when two large customers delayed payments at almost the same time, and another project was pushed back after construction delays. Dad called me on a Wednesday evening. He didn't start with guilt. That mattered when I looked back later. He said, "I'm in a cash flow problem. I was standing in my kitchen cutting vegetables for dinner." How bad? Bad enough that I may have trouble making payroll next month if two receivables don't clear. What does the bank say? They'll extend an emergency line if I bring in additional support. I stopped cutting. "You mean collateral?" "Aguarentur." There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm asking you." I didn't say yes. I asked him to send me the financial statements. He went quiet for a moment. "Morgan, I'm not asking you to buy the company, and I'm not agreeing to anything until I see the numbers." He gave a short laugh. "You really do talk like a risk department. You raised me." That got another laugh, a warmer one. The next evening, I went to the company office after most of the staff had left. Dad had printed cash flow reports, aged receivables, payroll obligations, existing debt, and the bank's proposed line. I spent almost 3 hours with him going through it. There was a real problem, but there was also a realistic path out. The company had invoices due from customers with solid payment histories. The delayed project hadn't disappeared. Dad needed temporary liquidity, not a miracle. Still, I did not sign what the bank initially proposed. The first draft exposed me to more risk than I was comfortable accepting. Dad leaned back in his chair when I said that. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I know you don't plan to." His expression changed slightly. I turned the page around and pointed to the language. "But the contract doesn't say your intentions are collateral. You really are going to negotiate with your father." "I'm going to negotiate with the bank." He shook his head, half amused and half irritated. "Most daughters would just help. Most daughters shouldn't sign something they don't understand." That stopped him. I saw recognition on his face, and for a second we were back at the kitchen table. Then he smiled. "Fine. Show me what you want changed." I agreed to a limited personal guarantee capped at $150,000. It applied only to that specific facility. I insisted on clear termination language and wanted confirmation when the line was paid off. I did not mortgage my townhouse. I did not empty my retirement account. I did not drain my savings to prove I loved my father. I accepted a defined risk after reviewing the business that created it. That distinction became important later because my parents would eventually describe the old guarantee as proof that I had always stood behind Dad's company. That wasn't what happened. I helped once. And even then, I made rules. For the first year, Dad sent me quarterly updates because I required them. Sometimes they were 3 days late, and I reminded him. Sometimes he added jokes about having to report to his most demanding investor, even though I wasn't an investor at all. But the company recovered, the customers paid, new work came in, the emergency line stopped being an emergency. By 2023, the balance was paid off. The bank sent confirmation that my obligation under that facility had ended. I saved it in both digital and paper form. Nathan hadn't even met my parents yet when I filed those documents away, which later became another reason I hated hearing Mom claim he had somehow convinced me to turn against them. I also sent Dad an email after the release came through. I found it again the morning after I received the forged-looking guarantee. I had written, "I'm glad I could help with this facility. Please don't treat it as standing consent for future borrowing. If you ever need me involved again, I need to review the numbers and documents first." Dad's reply was one word: understood. I read that word for a long time. It wasn't ambiguous. He hadn't written that family shouldn't need formal consent. He hadn't argued that my guarantee should continue indefinitely. He hadn't misunderstood me. He had understood. By Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting across from Elena Park in a conference room at her office downtown. Elena handled commercial disputes and financial fraud matters. I had found her through a professional referral, then checked her background myself before calling, because apparently I was still capable of treating every relationship except family with appropriate caution. She read the new guarantee, the old guarantee, the release, my Friday denial email, and Dad's understood response. Then she looked at me. "First thing, stop calling the new signature forged when you're talking to anyone outside privileged conversations with me. I've been careful. Keep being careful. It may be an unauthorized reproduction. It may be a copied signature image. It may involve an electronic process we haven't seen yet. We don't need you becoming a handwriting expert. I'm not trying to. I know. I'm telling you because angry people become very certain very quickly." I almost smiled. "You've met my family?" "I've met people." She asked what I'd already done. I explained the lender hold, fraud alerts, credit freezes, the identity theft documentation, the formal report, and the records I'd preserved. Elena nodded without making a performance out of approving me. "Good. Don't contact anyone at your father's company asking for internal records. Don't log into anything you don't have authorization to access. Don't ask employees to send confidential files." I wasn't planning to. Also, don't delete anything because it hurts your feelings. That wasn't on my list either. It becomes everyone's list eventually. She sorted the documents into separate piles. This one matters. She tapped the old guarantee. Limited exposure. Then, the release. This matters more than you think. Then my email. And this is excellent. Because I told him not to use me again? Because he acknowledged it. I looked at Dad's one-word reply. Elena leaned back. "You don't have to prove you never helped your father. In fact, trying to do that would be stupid because you did help him. I know. You need to keep the issue narrow. You helped on one facility under one written agreement. That facility ended. You expressly told him future involvement required new review and consent. He acknowledged that. Now a different guarantee appears with your name on it." She slid the new document toward me. "The question is not whether Morgan Ellis loves her father. The question is whether Morgan Ellis authorized this obligation." Hearing it framed that way did something to me. For years, every disagreement with my family had eventually been dragged into a referendum on my character. If I refused to lend Brittany money, I didn't care about my sister. If I asked Dad for financial statements, I didn't trust him. If I said no to Mom, I was becoming distant. Elena had reduced the problem to the thing my family hated most: a yes or no question. I had not authorized the guarantee. Nothing else changed that. The lender's compliance team began sending records directly related to my alleged consent. They did not hand over Dad's entire loan file, and Elena never asked them to. What we received was narrower: the disputed guarantee, notes concerning me as guarantor, and communications in which my supposed participation had been represented. One lender note contained a sentence that made me read it twice. Borrower principal states, "Morgan Ellis is fully informed regarding refinance and remains willing to support company obligations." Borrower principal meant Dad. I asked Elena, "Is there anything from me?" "Not yet." "No email?" "No." "Phone confirmation?" "Nothing produced." "Meeting notes with me?" "No." I pointed at the scanned guarantee. "So they had this, and Dad saying I knew. That appears to be what we have so far." I looked down at the table. Dad hadn't merely submitted paperwork and stayed silent. He had spoken for me. That realization bothered me almost more than the signature. A reproduced signature could be described as a document problem. Dad telling another institution what I supposedly knew and wanted was personal. I called him that evening and asked if we could meet privately at his office the next morning. I did not tell him Elena had received lender records. I did not tell him exactly which documents I had. He agreed too quickly. Ellis Commercial Flooring occupied a low brick building in an industrial area north of Columbus. I had been there hundreds of times. As a child, I used to sit behind the reception desk after school and draw on scrap paper while Dad finished work. When I was in college, I helped him move old files during one summer break. The place smelled exactly as I remembered: coffee, carpet adhesive, cardboard, and the faint chemical scent of flooring samples. Dad was waiting in his office. He didn't hug me. He closed the door and said, "I assume this is about the bank." "Yes." He sighed, like I had brought him an inconvenience. I sat across from his desk. "Did you tell the lender I was fully informed about the refinance?" He looked at me for a moment. "I told them you'd supported the company before." "That isn't what I asked. Morgan, this entire situation has gotten blown completely out of proportion. Did you tell them I was informed and willing to support this refinance?" He rubbed a hand across his forehead. "I told them we had family support. My name isn't family support. My name is mine." His eyes narrowed slightly. "There," he said. "There what?" That tone. I almost laughed because Mom had used the same tactic all my life. I kept my voice level. The guarantee I signed in 2021 was limited to $150,000 and one facility. It was released in 2023. I know what it was. Then why is there a new continuing guarantee with my signature? He didn't answer immediately. That silence was the first real answer he gave me. Finally, he said, "It was continuing what you'd already done for us." "No, it wasn't. You've signed for me before. And you understood that the old guarantee ended." He leaned back. "You're splitting hairs." "No, I'm reading contracts. You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean. You think because I agreed once, you shouldn't have needed to ask again." Dad's jaw tightened. "I was trying to protect a company that employs more than 20 people. By putting my name on an obligation I didn't approve?" He looked toward the window. I studied him. I had come into that office still carrying one last possibility I hadn't admitted even to Nathan. Maybe an employee had reused the wrong form. Maybe a lender had attached the wrong document. Maybe some system had pulled an old signature into a new package without Dad understanding what happened. It wasn't that I thought those explanations were likely. I wanted one of them to be true, so I gave him the chance. "Dad, if you didn't know that signature was there, say that." He looked back at me. He did not say it. Instead, he said, "Nothing was going to happen to you." My stomach tightened. That isn't what an innocent person says. "Oh, stop. If somebody forged your daughter's signature and put her on an unlimited guarantee, the normal reaction would be to ask, who did it? I know my company." "Then tell me who did it." "You are acting like someone tried to rob you." "I was put on debt I never agreed to. Debt that would have been paid. You don't get to make that decision for me." He stood abruptly and walked around his desk. "This is exactly what your mother has been talking about. You get married and suddenly everything with us needs a contract, a lawyer, a boundary." I stood too. "The old guarantee had a contract because you asked me to risk my money. You had the money." The sentence landed harder than he intended. I looked at him. He seemed to realize it because his expression shifted, but he didn't take it back. Instead, he said, "I'm saying you were never in danger. You don't know that. I know this business better than you do. Then why do you need my credit attached to it?" His face hardened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I thought about being 16 at the kitchen table. "Your name is worth more than anything you own." I wondered whether he remembered saying it. Maybe he did. Maybe that was why he couldn't look directly at me. I picked up my bag. He said, "Morgan." I stopped at the door. "This does not need to destroy the family." I turned around. I didn't put my signature on that guarantee. His expression didn't change. That was what I carried with me out of the building. Not an admission. Something worse in a different way. My father had just learned, or claimed to have just learned, that a disputed signature had tied his daughter to more than $1 million of business debt. He had not asked who created it. He had not asked whether I was protected. He had not offered to help investigate it. He had spent the entire conversation explaining why I should have agreed. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. Not dramatically. Just enough that I had to sit for a minute before starting the engine. I wasn't afraid of Dad. I was trying to fit the man I had just spoken to over the man who had once taught me that a signature was a promise no one else had the right to make for you. The two versions didn't fit. My phone rang before I left the parking lot. It was Elena. "I just received another production from the lender," she said. "What is it?" "The borrower portal activity tied to the guarantee submission." I looked back at Dad's building through the windshield. Elena continued. "The scan didn't come from some unidentified employee account." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Whose account?" "David Ellis." For a moment, I heard nothing except the air coming through the car vents. Elena kept talking, careful as always. "The portal log shows his authenticated borrower credentials uploaded the guarantee file. That doesn't by itself tell us who created the signature image, but it answers who submitted it to the lender." I stared at the office window where my father was still somewhere inside. 20 minutes earlier, he had looked me in the eye and described the document as if it were merely an extension of something I had already done for him. Now I knew why he hadn't asked who sent it. He had. And the question I had been asking since the wedding changed. I no longer needed to know whether someone at Dad's company had slipped my signature into the loan file without his knowledge. I needed to know where my father had gotten that signature, why my mother had helped remove the verification packet, and how much Brittany had known when she opened my case. Knowing Dad had personally uploaded the guarantee changed the problem, but it did not answer the question that bothered me most. I knew who had put the document into the lender's system. I still didn't know why a man who had spent most of my life warning me about debt had reached a point where he was willing to use my name without permission. Elena told me not to confuse motive with proof, and she was right. So that evening, I opened a clean notebook and divided the first page into 3 columns: what I knew, what I could prove, and what I only suspected. Under what I knew, I wrote that Dad was seeking a refinance of more than $1 million. The lender had a continuing guarantee bearing my name. I had not signed it. Dad's authenticated borrower account had uploaded the file. Mom had seen the lender envelope inside my document case, held my purse while the case key was inside it, and later helped push a replacement wedding slideshow that accidentally showed the case standing open. Brittany had been in the room when the case was open. The packet disappeared before the reception ended. Under what I could prove, I was much stricter. My denial email existed. The old limited guarantee existed. The release existed. Dad's old reply, saying he understood future borrowing required fresh consent, existed. The lender's portal log existed. The replacement slideshow emails existed. The original wedding photograph had metadata placing Brittany near the open case during the period Mom held my purse. Everything else was still inference. Under what I suspected, I wrote more slowly. Dad knew the new guarantee wasn't authorized. Mom knew enough to help retrieve the verification package. Brittany had opened the case. The refinance was in worse shape than Dad had admitted. And somewhere underneath all of it was a reason large enough to make 3 people believe taking documents out of my locked case at my wedding was preferable to simply asking me for help. Nathan leaned over the back of the couch and read the columns. "You left one out." "What?" "What you're angry about." "That isn't evidence." "I didn't say it was." I looked at the page again. "I can be angry later. You've been saying that since Friday. I was married Saturday. It's Tuesday." "Exactly." I gave him a look, but he only kissed the top of my head and walked back toward the kitchen. He was learning when to push and when to leave me with my own thoughts. I was learning that having someone notice I was hurting didn't automatically mean I had to stop functioning. My phone rang before I finished the page. The caller was my mother's older sister, Aunt Diane. We weren't especially close, but she had always been pleasant to me. And I knew before answering that Mom had gotten to her first. "Morgan," she said carefully, "is everything all right with Nathan?" That was almost impressive. My father had uploaded a guarantee bearing my unauthorized signature. My sister had been photographed next to my open document case. And somehow Nathan was already the problem. What did Mom tell you? She didn't tell me anything exactly. Then why are you asking about my husband? There was a pause. She said things have changed since the engagement. That you're treating your father like a stranger and refusing to help with the business when you know what it means to the family. I closed my notebook. What else? She said Nathan thinks your parents depend on you too much. I glanced toward the kitchen. Nathan was rinsing 2 plates, completely unaware that he'd apparently become the architect of my rebellion. Aunt Diane, has Nathan ever spoken to you about my parents' finances? No. Has he ever asked you for money? Of course not. Has he ever asked Dad for money? No. Then maybe we should leave him out of a financial dispute he didn't create. Her voice softened. I'm not taking sides. You called me to ask whether my husband is turning me against my father. That's a side, even if you didn't mean it to be. She exhaled. Your mother said you used to promise you'd always stand behind the company. That was new. I remembered several versions of conversations in which I'd said I would help if Dad was ever genuinely in trouble. I also remembered attaching conditions to almost every one of them. Mom had always heard the emotional promise and somehow lost the financial boundaries attached to it. Did she show you something I wrote? She mentioned a text. I haven't seen it. Then don't make a decision about what I promised until you have. I didn't say I had. I know. I'm asking you not to. We ended the call politely. I didn't call Mom afterward. I didn't text the family group, and I didn't start forwarding documents to relatives. That would have pulled me onto the battlefield she wanted, where everything became competing stories and whoever sounded more wounded got believed first. Instead, I wrote one more line in my notebook. Patricia is building a public version before the facts are complete. That belonged under what I knew. The next morning, Elena arranged a short conversation with Martin Green, the accounting manager who had worked at Dad's company for more than a decade. I knew Martin from company Christmas dinners and a few meetings during the old credit line problem. He wasn't part of some secret alliance against Dad, and Elena was careful about keeping it that way. We did not ask him to download records, send confidential statements, or tell us anything he wasn't authorized to discuss. The questions were limited to conversations involving my supposed participation in the refinance. Martin sounded uncomfortable from the moment he joined the call. I don't want to get in the middle of a family dispute, he said. Neither do I told him. I'm asking whether my name was discussed in connection with the guarantee. He was quiet for several seconds. Yes. By whom? Your father. When? More than once during the refinance process. What did he say? Martin cleared his throat. That you were on board. The phrase matched the lender notes closely enough that I wrote it down. Did you ever speak to me about the refinance? No. Did you ever receive an email from me approving it? Not that I saw. Did you ask Dad whether I had approved it directly? Another pause. Yes. I stopped writing. What did you ask? Martin answered carefully. I told him the new facility was materially different from the old one and asked if you had actually agreed to the broader guarantee. What did he say? He said you were on board and that the family discussions had already happened. Nathan was sitting across the table from me. His eyes lifted at that. Elena asked, Did Mr. Ellis provide the supporting documents for the guarantor portion of the package? Martin hesitated again. He controlled what went into the refinance submission. I prepared some financial schedules. I didn't prepare Morgan's guarantee. Did you upload it? No. That aligned with the portal log. For about a day, before we had received the authenticated upload record, I had wondered whether someone in accounting might have reused the wrong signature page or pulled an old file into a new package. Martin had access to historical records. So did other office employees. That possibility had allowed me to preserve one last layer of distance between Dad and the signature. That layer was gone. When the call ended, Nathan said, He gave your dad a chance to correct it. Yes. And your dad doubled down. Yes. I added Martin's recollection to the evidence map, but I labeled it correctly. Corroboration. Not proof of who created the signature image. Not proof that Dad had personally copied anything. What it proved was narrower and still ugly. Someone inside his company questioned whether I had actually agreed, and Dad told that person I had. That afternoon, Brittany called me. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered and said, "If this is about Mom, I'm not discussing Mom." "It's not." Her voice sounded defensive already. "What is it?" "I heard you're calling people at Dad's company." I spoke with one employee through counsel about statements made concerning my alleged guarantee. "You make everything sound like a deposition now. You opened my case at my wedding. I told you I was looking for your vows." "No, you told me Mom wanted my vows. They're basically the same thing." "They really aren't." She sighed loudly. "This is exactly why nobody can talk to you." I nearly laughed. The family had used my name on $1 million plus financial obligation, yet apparently precision was my personality defect. "What do you want, Brittany?" "I want you to understand what Dad is dealing with." "Then explain it." Her tone changed immediately, as though she'd been waiting for permission. "The company has been carrying my studio for a while." I leaned back in my chair. "Define carrying." "Sometimes Dad's company covered invoices for me when clients were late." "How often?" "I don't know." "You own the studio." "So?" "So you should know how often someone else pays your bills." "I pay them back." "All of them?" Silence. "I didn't fill it." Finally, she said, "The refinance was supposed to clean things up." There it was. The story my parents wanted me to believe. Brittany's studio had been struggling. Dad had helped. The refinance would settle everything. Morgan was the financially secure older sister refusing to save everybody over some paperwork technicality. "How much does your studio owe Dad's company?" "I don't know the exact number." "Is it over 100,000? I said I don't know." "Then call me when you do." "You're really going to make this about accounting?" "Brittany, it already is about accounting." She made a frustrated sound. "You have no idea what it's like building something from nothing." That one almost got me. I didn't own a company, and Brittany knew it. She liked describing my career as safe because I received a salary, as though stability had simply arrived in my mailbox one morning instead of taking years of work. "You're right," I said. "I don't own a design studio." She seemed surprised by the lack of argument. "But if your business needs someone else's company to pay rent, inventory, and vendor invoices, then I need to know that before you tell me my signature was necessary to save it." "I didn't say your signature was necessary." "Then what was it for?" She went silent again. When she finally answered, her voice was lower. "Ask Dad." "I am." She ended the call soon afterward. I sat there thinking about something Mom had told me when Brittany and I were younger. I had been 23, newly employed, and living in an apartment with furniture assembled from flat boxes and whatever dishes relatives had given me when I moved out. Brittany was still in school and had gotten herself into trouble with a credit card. Mom called and asked whether I could cover part of it. I told her Brittany needed to learn to budget. Mom replied, "She needs more help than you do. You always land on your feet." At 23, I heard pride in that sentence. By 38, I understood the hidden math. If I landed on my feet, I could be pushed harder. If Brittany fell, someone had to build cushions. My competence didn't reduce the family's demands on me, it justified them. The next morning, Dad emailed me. The subject line said, "Numbers you asked for." There was no apology. No mention of the guarantee. No acknowledgement that his authenticated credentials had uploaded it. Instead, he wrote that I was making assumptions without understanding the financial position of Ellis Commercial Flooring, and that if I wanted to judge his decisions, I should at least review the actual situation. He attached what looked like a carefully selected rescue package. I forwarded everything to Elena before opening the attachments. She called me 15 minutes later. "You can review what he voluntarily sent you," she said. "Don't assume it's complete." "I won't. And don't assume because something looks official that it's the same version the lender relied on." "Understood." Nathan laughed from across the kitchen when he heard me say it. "What?" "Nothing. That word has developed a personality in this family." I knew exactly what he meant. Dad's package contained a lender terms summary, a use of proceeds schedule, recent selected financial statements, aging summaries, and a short narrative he'd apparently prepared to explain why the refinance was necessary. I had reviewed enough distressed business packages at work to recognize what he was doing. He wasn't opening the books. He was showing me the pieces that supported his argument. Still, those pieces told me more than he'd intended. The refinance was approximately $1,180,000. I didn't need every line item memorized to understand the categories. A portion would refinance existing secured debt. Another would address overdue supplier balances. There were tax-related obligations. There was working capital money intended to stop the company from running on fumes. There were also related party balances. I looked at those longer. Dad had framed the crisis to me as a temporary problem created by delayed customers, rising costs, and support for Brittany. The numbers described something broader. Suppliers had been stretched while money continued moving to members and related parties. The company had been under pressure for longer than he'd admitted. Nathan brought coffee and set it beside me. What does that face mean? It means this isn't one bad quarter. How bad? I don't know yet. I opened another statement. Some of the member distributions were not outrageous by themselves. Owners of an S corporation taking distributions was not automatically suspicious, and I wasn't going to pretend every dollar Dad and Mom had received was theft. That would have been easy storytelling and bad financial analysis. The problem was timing. The company was paying suppliers late while distributions continued. Cash was tight while related party payments kept appearing. Brittany's studio had received advances and vendor support. There were payments tied to inventory and occupancy costs. But even if I treated every one of those as money the family intended to recover later, it wasn't enough to explain the scale of the refinance. I moved backward through the statements Dad had sent. One period caught my attention, because I remembered it for reasons unrelated to business. Mom had renovated the kitchen and primary bathroom the previous year. She'd sent me pictures almost daily. New cabinets, stone countertops, custom lighting. A bathtub she'd described as the one thing I did for myself after 30 years. At the same time, company distributions had remained unusually high relative to weakening cash flow. Again, that didn't prove the company had directly paid for her renovation. I had no evidence for that. But it told me Dad had continued moving money out of a company that was already starting to struggle. I opened my notebook. What I know, what I can prove, what I only suspect. I wrote, company cash flow weakened before current refinance. Then, member distributions continued during periods of supplier delay. Then, Brittany, related support is real but appears smaller than total funding gap. That last line was the one I circled. For days, everyone had spoken as though Brittany explained everything. Brittany needed help. Brittany's studio had struggled. Brittany deserved support. Morgan could afford the risk. It was emotionally convenient because it fit the family structure perfectly. I was the strong daughter being asked to save the daughter who needed more. But the numbers didn't care about our roles. Brittany wasn't large enough to explain the whole. I called Dad. He answered on the fourth ring. Did you read what I sent? Yes. So now you understand. No. His silence sharpened. I understand the company has more debt and more overdue obligations than you told me. I understand distributions continued longer than they should have. I understand Brittany's studio received support. Then you understand why the refinance matters. I understand why you want it. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. He exhaled hard. Morgan, I sent you exactly what you asked for. No, you sent me enough to persuade me. What's that supposed to mean? The use of proceeds schedule doesn't explain how the company got here. Companies have cash flow cycles. I know. Customers pay late. I know. Material costs went up. I know that too. His voice hardened. Then stop talking to me like I'm an idiot. I haven't called you an idiot once. You don't have to. I shut my eyes for a second. This was the trap. Facts became tone. Questions became disrespect. If I defended my manner, we'd never return to the numbers. So I didn't. How much of the current shortfall is Brittany? What? You've all told me her studio is part of why this refinance is necessary. How much? I don't have that number in front of me. Then roughly. Why does it matter? Because the amount connected to Brittany doesn't explain $1,180,000 refinance. There was a long pause. Then Dad said, "This is bigger than Brittany." That was the first honest sentence he'd given me about the money. I sat straighter. How much bigger? You saw the statements. I saw selected statements. He didn't answer. What happened to the company, Dad? Nothing happened. We had a difficult period. A difficult period doesn't usually end with you putting somebody else's name on an unlimited guarantee. His voice dropped. We're not having that conversation again. We're having it until I understand why you thought it was necessary. I thought you wanted numbers. I want the forecast. He went quiet. I continued. Not another summary. I want the assumptions behind the refinance. Cash flow after closing. Debt service. Receivables. Supplier catch-up. Tax obligations. Everything the company is using to say this loan actually fixes the problem. You're not an owner. I know. Then you're not entitled to every internal document. Correct. That answer stopped him. I wasn't claiming rights I didn't have. I said, "You want me to understand why you believed I should support this company. Fine. If you want me to look at that question, I need to understand whether the refinance actually solves anything." He was quiet long enough that I could hear office sounds behind him. Finally, he said, "If I have Martin walk you through the forecast, are you going to approach this with an open mind?" I looked at the unauthorized guarantee sitting beside my laptop. My mind is open to facts. That isn't what I asked. It is what I'm offering. Another pause. Then he said, "Fine. I'll authorize Martin to go through it with you." When the call ended, I didn't feel victorious. I looked again at the use of proceeds schedule, then at the smaller number attached to Brittany's studio. For almost a week, my family had tried to hand me a simple explanation. Brittany needed saving. Dad needed refinancing. I had helped before and was supposedly refusing now because marriage had made me selfish. The documents Dad himself had sent had already broken that story. Brittany was expensive. She wasn't expensive enough. Whatever had pushed Ellis Commercial Flooring to the edge was larger than my sister, and Dad had just given me permission to look at the forecast that might finally show me what it was. Elena sent me the lender thread the next afternoon, and the first thing that struck me was how ordinary Dad's lie looked on the screen. There was no dramatic language, no desperate confession, nothing that sounded like a man asking a bank to trust a document his daughter had never signed. The loan officer had written that because the proposed facility was substantially larger than the one Ellis Commercial Flooring had used years earlier, the lender wanted direct confirmation of the guarantor's continuing willingness to support the company. Dad's reply was short. He said I had agreed in principle and that the family discussions had already happened. When the loan officer asked whether there was direct written confirmation from me, Dad answered that I had supported the business before and that final documentation was being coordinated. I read the thread 3 times, partly because I was angry and partly because I wanted to make sure anger wasn't changing what the words meant. Dad had not accidentally allowed the lender to assume I knew. He had actively filled the space where my consent should have been with his own description of what I supposedly wanted. The phrase "agreed in principle" bothered me most because it sounded professional enough to survive casual scrutiny while being vague enough to avoid saying when, where, or how I had agreed. It was exactly the kind of language I warned people about at work. Elena called before I finished reading. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "Don't call him yet." I wasn't going to. "You paused too long. I hate that you know me already." "I know clients, there's a difference." I turned back to Dad's email. He told them I agreed. He represented that you had agreed in principle. That's significant. But before you confront him, we need to see what else the lender produces and compare it against what he knew at each point. I have his old understood email. Yes. I have the release. Yes. I have my denial before closing. Yes. And now I have this. You have pieces, Elena said. Pieces become stronger when the other side doesn't know which ones you have. I knew that. In fact, if one of my employees had been handling a dispute this way, I would have given almost the same advice. Preserve the record. Don't reveal your strongest evidence while the other person is still creating theirs. Let inconsistent statements accumulate before you show where they conflict. Then Dad called me. That was all it took. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask whether I was all right. He said, "Your mother says you're telling relatives I forged your signature. I haven't told relatives anything." Well, people are talking. Maybe because Mom is calling them. There was a pause. Then he said, "Come over tonight. We need to end this before it becomes something none of us can take back." That sentence irritated me more than it should have. Something none of us can take back, as if I were standing at the edge of a decision instead of reacting to choices he'd already made. I told him I'd come by after work, then hung up and stared at Elena's last message on my screen. "Don't show him your hand." I knew better. I went anyway. Mom opened the door before I knocked a second time. She looked tired, but not in a way that made me feel guilty anymore. For most of my adult life, tiredness on her face had functioned like an accusation. If she looked exhausted, someone else was supposed to relieve her, usually me. That evening, I simply followed her into the living room and sat across from Dad. Brittany wasn't there. Dad had printed several pages and arranged them neatly on the coffee table. "I want you to see what happens if this refinance falls apart. I've seen the numbers you sent, not the full consequences." He pushed a page toward me. It listed payroll, vendor balances, tax obligations, and several projects he said could be disrupted if suppliers tightened terms. "These aren't numbers on one of your risk reports, Morgan. These are people's jobs. I know employees are involved. Do you?" Mom sat beside him. "Because you don't act like it." I looked at her. What would acting like it look like? Not trying to destroy your father's company over paperwork. There it was again. Paperwork. As if the difference between my signature and somebody else's reproduction of it were administrative clutter. I turned to Dad. "Why did you tell the lender I agreed in principle?" Mom's head moved toward him. Dad didn't answer immediately. "Because you had agreed to support the company before." "That isn't what I asked. You said you'd always stand behind me. I said I'd review things if you needed help again." "That is not how I remember it." I took out my phone. This was the moment I should have stopped. Instead, I opened the lender thread Elena had sent me and placed the screen on the table. "You told them family discussions had already happened." Dad glanced at it, then at me. I continued. "They asked whether you had direct confirmation from me. You didn't have it. You're reading routine lender correspondence like it's a confession. It's a statement about my consent. I knew how you felt about the company." "No. You knew what you wanted me to feel." His expression hardened. I should have let the silence work. Instead, I kept going. "The old guarantee was released in 2023. I still have the release. I also have the email where I told you not to treat that guarantee as standing consent, and you replied that you understood." Dad's eyes changed. "Not much, but enough for me to notice." Mom said, "You saved an email from years ago just so you could use it against your father?" "I saved financial records because that's what responsible adults do. Listen to yourself." I ignored her. "And before the wedding," I said, looking at Dad, "I told the lender in writing that I had not authorized the new guarantee. They acknowledged it before the planned closing. That was when I knew I'd made the mistake." Dad stopped arguing. It was immediate. The irritation left his face and something more controlled replaced it. "What exactly did you tell them?" I heard Elena's voice in my head. "Don't show him your hand." He sat back. Dad waited. I had given him the existence of the old release, the existence of his acknowledgement, and the fact that my denial had a timestamp before closing. 3 things he had not known for certain when I'd walked into the room. I knew better. I had been angry, and I had shown him my hand. "I think we're done," I said. Dad almost smiled. "You came here, and now I'm leaving." Mom stood when I did. "So that's it? You won't even listen to what happens to everyone else?" I listened. "Your father spent his entire life building that company." "I know. And your sister has her business tied into it." "I know that too." "Then how can you walk out?" I looked at her. "Because none of those things gave Dad permission to speak for me." Dad said quietly, "Nothing was ever going to happen to you." I turned toward him. "You've said that before." "Because it's true." "No, it's what you needed to believe." I left before he could answer. In the car, I didn't call Elena immediately because I already knew what she was going to say. I sat with both hands on the steering wheel and replayed the conversation instead. Dad had spent the first half trying to persuade me. The second I revealed the old release and the denial timestamp, he'd stopped trying to persuade me and started asking what I had told the lender. That was the moment he stopped treating me as his daughter and started treating me as the opposing side of a dispute. The worst part was that I had helped him make the transition. When I finally called Elena, I didn't make excuses. I told him about the release, the old email, and the timestamp. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. That's it? What do you want me to say? That I was stupid." "You weren't stupid. You were angry. I knew better." "Yes. That hurt more because she didn't soften it." I showed him my hand. "You showed him part of it. So now we assume he adjusts." I leaned my head against the seat. "How much damage did I do?" "That depends on what he does next." We didn't have to wait long. Over the next several days, Dad changed the way he communicated so noticeably that even Nathan pointed it out. Before our confrontation, Dad had sent emails. He had texted. He had attached documents. Afterward, almost every attempt to reach me came by phone. If I didn't answer, he left messages asking me to call him back rather than putting his position in writing. At first, I couldn't prove that change meant anything. Then the lender received a new written statement from him. Elena forwarded it to me as soon as compliance produced it. Dad's revised position was that I had orally agreed to continue supporting the company during family conversations before the refinance. According to him, I had become hesitant only after the wedding, when personal stress and outside influence changed my position. Outside influence. He didn't name Nathan in that sentence. He didn't need to. I called Elena. He changed the timeline. He clarified the timeline, according to him, after I told him exactly what documents I have. Yes. He's saying I agreed orally before the wedding and withdrew later because my written denial makes it impossible to say I agreed at closing. That is one reasonable interpretation. I hated how carefully she spoke. Can we show that this statement came after our confrontation? Yes. The lender's records date both submissions. Sequence matters. I opened my evidence notebook and added a line under the new statement. Created after David learned Morgan retained old release and pre-closing denial. It wasn't proof that he had invented the story after hearing my evidence, but it gave the story a history. And histories mattered. Mom's counterattack arrived less formally. Aunt Diane sent me a screenshot on Thursday evening with the message, "I think you should know your mother is showing people this." The screenshot contained a text from me. "If Dad ever needs me to stand behind the company again, I will." Nothing below it, nothing above it, just that sentence. For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if I had written it. The phrasing sounded like me, but I didn't remember promising Dad anything that unconditional. Then I noticed the date. It was from the family group thread we had used during the old credit line problem. Mom, Dad, Brittany, and I had all been in it. I searched my phone. The full message was still there. "If Dad ever needs me to stand behind the company again, I will look at the numbers first. I will never sign blind again. Helping once doesn't mean I can promise yes to something I haven't seen." Dad had replied with a thumbs up. Mom had sent a heart. Brittany had written, "Banker Morgan strikes again." I stared at the original thread until anger moved through me so quickly my face went hot. Nathan was sitting across the room reading something on his tablet. "What happened?" I handed him both versions. He looked from the clipped screenshot to the full message. "That's deliberate." "Yes. Your mom sent this? Aunt Diane says she's showing it to relatives. Send everyone the full thread." I almost did. My thumb was already over the screenshot button. Then I stopped. If I sent the full message to a dozen relatives, Mom would answer with another story. Dad would say context was complicated. Brittany would post something vague. We would spend the next week holding a family trial through text messages, while the actual lender dispute continued somewhere underneath it. I saved both images instead. "Not yet," I said. Nathan looked frustrated. "Why not?" "Because I don't need Aunt Diane to decide whether my guarantee is valid. This isn't about the guarantee anymore. They're telling people you broke a promise. I know. And you're going to let them? For now. He set the tablet down. Morgan, there is a point where refusing to respond stops being strategic and starts becoming you absorbing it. That hit close enough that I stiffened. You think I'm absorbing this? I think you've spent years letting them define what happens and then quietly proving them wrong to yourself. I stood. You met them 3 years ago. He looked up at me. I knew the moment the next words left my mouth that they were unfair, but I said them anyway. You get to call them toxic and go home. They're my parents. The room went still. Nathan didn't stand. He didn't tell me I was irrational. He didn't remind me of everything they'd done. He nodded once. You're right. That disarmed me more than an argument would have. He continued. I get to be angry because they hurt you. But I don't have to wake up remembering your dad teaching you how to drive or your mom sitting beside you when you were sick. I don't have to figure out where those people went. I looked away. So tell me what you want from me, he said. Not what I think you should do. What do you want me to do? My anger collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen. I don't know yet. That's fine. I don't want you talking to my relatives about this. Okay? I don't want you contacting my parents. Okay. And if they call you, don't defend me. That surprised him. Why? Because that's exactly what Mom wants. If you argue with them, she gets to say this is you versus them. Nathan considered it, then nodded. If they call, I send them back to you. Yes. He picked up his tablet again, then paused. For the record, I still think the screenshot is disgusting. Despite myself, I smiled. That part you're allowed to think. Brittany made her move the following morning. She didn't name me. That would have been too obvious. She posted a photograph from the wedding of herself with Mom and Dad. The caption said something about how marriage should add people to a family, not make anyone forget who loved them before. New names. No accusation. Nothing I could point to and say, she lied about me. Within an hour, several relatives had reacted to it. Then Nathan's phone rang. He looked at the screen and showed me Aunt Diane's husband's name. Do you want me to ignore it? No. Answer. He put the call on speaker only after I nodded. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. My uncle didn't accuse Nathan directly, but he asked whether there was some way to get Morgan to calm down and whether Nathan thought all this legal stuff was necessary. Nathan listened. Then he said, Morgan makes her own decisions. If you want to understand them, you need to ask her. My uncle tried again. I'm only saying sometimes after people get married, priorities change. They do, and families can feel pushed out. Nathan looked at me. That's something you should discuss with Morgan. He ended the call politely. I stared at his phone after he set it down. They called you to ask you to control me. Yes, because they think you're controlling me. That appears to be the theory. I didn't laugh. For years, whenever I made decisions my family liked, I was independent, sensible Morgan. The moment I made one, they disliked. Suddenly, somebody else had to be influencing me. Even my refusal wasn't allowed to belong to me. That realization hurt in a place the financial documents didn't reach. The guarantee threatened my money. This threatened my authorship of my own life. Elena called later that afternoon with another update from the lender. I took the call in my home office while Nathan worked downstairs. David submitted a more formal statement, she said. The one about oral consent? Expanded version. I opened my notebook. He says there were multiple family conversations in which you expressed willingness to support the company if necessary. I've said I'd help if Dad needed me. That isn't the same as agreeing to a guarantee. I know. More importantly, he still does not identify a conversation where you reviewed or approved the specific new guarantee. That sounds deliberate. It may be. I wrote that down. Then Elena said, he named a witness. My pen stopped. To what? Your supposed oral willingness to stand behind the refinance. I didn't need to ask. I already knew. My family had spent the week building a story out of every vague thing I had ever said about helping Dad, and there was only one person whose voice could make that story sound less like a father speaking for his daughter and more like a conversation someone else had actually heard. Elena asked, Do you know who he named? I looked at the wedding photograph still sitting in the evidence folder on my desk. Brittany smiling in the foreground. My locked case open behind her. Yes, I said. Brittany. When Elena told me Brittany was the witness Dad had named, I expected anger. What I felt instead was something colder. Dad had spent days reshaping the story after learning what evidence I had, and now he was attaching my sister's name to it as if her presence could turn a vague family conversation into consent. It was clever in a way I hated. Brittany had been close enough to our parents for years that nobody would question why she had heard discussions about the company. She was also the person standing beside my open document case in the wedding photograph. If she supported Dad's version, the same person I suspected of taking the lender packet would be helping explain away the transaction that packet had warned me about. What exactly did he say she witnessed? I asked. Elena read from the lender's record. He says Brittany was present during multiple family discussions, in which you expressed willingness to support the company if the refinance became necessary. That still doesn't say I agreed to this guarantee. No. Does he identify when these conversations happened? One is described as a family dinner earlier this year. Another is described generally as a conversation during the summer. I knew which dinner he meant before Elena finished. Mom's birthday. We had gone to a steakhouse in Dublin. Dad complained about commercial construction slowing down. Brittany complained about a client who still owed her studio money, and Mom made a joke about how I was the only one at the table who understood interest rates well enough to keep everyone out of trouble. At some point, Dad had said, "If things ever get ugly, at least I know Morgan won't let me drown." I had answered, "If things get ugly, show me the numbers before you drown." Everyone laughed. That was it. I remembered because Nathan had been there. "Dad is using a joke at Mom's birthday dinner," I said. Elena didn't sound surprised. "Can Nathan confirm the conversation?" "Yes." "Good. Don't coach him. Have him write down what he independently remembers while it's fresh." Already doing it. Another lesson I didn't need to be taught twice. Nathan sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote his memory of the dinner without seeing mine. When we compared them, the language wasn't identical, which made me trust it more. We both remembered Dad saying I wouldn't let him drown. We both remembered me telling him to show me the numbers. Neither of us remembered the words guarantee, refinance, signature, loan amount, or lender. Nathan looked at the 2 pages. "So, Brittany has to know this isn't what your dad is making it sound like. She might remember it differently." He gave me a look. I said might. "You're still doing that thing where you build the best possible explanation for them." "No, I'm making sure I don't replace their certainty with mine." That was true, but not completely. The uglier truth was that part of me still wanted Brittany to disappoint me less than she already had. I called her that evening. She answered after several rings. "Did Dad ask you to tell the lender I agreed to support the refinance?" Silence. Then she said, "He asked me what I remembered." "What do you remember?" "You said you'd help him." "When?" "Lots of times." "With this refinance?" "You never said you wouldn't help until everything blew up." "That isn't an answer." "It is an answer. You always said family comes first." "I have never used those words about signing business debt." "You don't have to phrase everything like a contract." I closed my eyes. "Brittany, Dad told the lender you witnessed conversations where I expressed willingness to support this refinance. Did you witness that? You said you'd look at the numbers. That is not consent. You were open to helping. Open to reviewing something is not the same as agreeing to $1 million plus continuing guarantee." She exhaled sharply. "You keep saying the amount like Dad was going to make you pay it. Then why was my guarantee necessary?" "Because lenders want security." "Exactly." She went quiet. I continued. "Why did you open my case?" "Oh my God. That's still relevant. I told you. You told me you were looking for my vows. Then Dad named you as his witness to my supposed consent. Those 2 things now overlap. You make everything sound sinister." "No, I make timelines." Her voice hardened. "Do you want me to say Dad is a criminal? Is that what this is?" "I want you to tell the truth." "I am." "Then tell the lender exactly what I said at Mom's birthday dinner." "I don't remember every word." "Neither do I. That's why you shouldn't turn it into something more specific than it was." She stopped speaking. I heard movement in the background, then a door closing. When Brittany came back, her voice was lower. You don't understand what happens if Dad loses the refinance. Then help me understand. People lose jobs. I know. Mom and Dad could lose the house. That was new. I sat straighter. Why? Another pause. Because everything is connected. What does that mean? I don't know all of it. Do they have a lien against the house? I don't know. Did Dad borrow against it? I said I don't know everything. But you know enough to tell me they could lose it. She sounded close to tears now, which would have worked on me differently a year earlier. Dad said if this doesn't get fixed, they could lose everything. I wrote the sentence down. Did he tell you the refinance was primarily for your studio? No. That answer came too quickly. What did he tell you? That it would stabilize the company and clean up the other stuff. What other stuff? Debt. Whose? I don't know. Brittany. I don't know. I let the silence sit until she broke it. Some of theirs. There it was. Not the whole truth, but the first crack in the story I'd been given. How much? I don't know. Did Dad tell you company money had been covering personal debts? He didn't say it like that. How did he say it? That the company and the family had supported each other for years. That sounded exactly like Dad. It was the language he used when boundaries became inconvenient. The company supported the family. The family supported the company. Everything flowed back and forth until ownership became emotional instead of legal. Then he could say my credit belonged in the same pool. I asked, did Mom know? Brittany went quiet again. Did Mom know they were using the refinance to solve personal debts? She knows they have debt. That isn't what I asked. I have to go. Brittany. What? If Dad is asking you to say I agreed to something you know I never reviewed, don't do it. She was silent long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, you don't know what Dad told me. No, I don't. That's why I'm asking you to stop helping him tell people what I supposedly said. She ended the call without answering. The next morning, Martin met with me by video, under Dad's written authorization to walk through the company's refinance forecast. Elena joined for the first few minutes to make sure everyone understood the scope. Martin was not giving me free access to company records. He was reviewing the forecast Dad had chosen to show me because Dad still thought numbers would convince me to rescue him. That distinction mattered. Martin shared his screen. The first section was ordinary enough. Revenue projections by project. Receivables expected over the next 6 months. Supplier catch-up payments. Payroll. Equipment leases. Tax obligations. Debt service under the proposed refinance. Then we reached owner-related obligations. I asked him to slow down. What does this line represent? Martin hesitated. Amounts advanced through company accounts for owner-related expenses. Personnel? Some. How much remains outstanding? He gave me a number. I didn't speak immediately. It was far larger than the kitchen renovation I'd been picturing. I asked, are these booked as distributions? Some are distributions. Some are shareholder receivables. Some moved through related party accounts. Why are they included in the refinance assumptions? Because the company needs enough liquidity after closing to absorb the cash impact. In plain English, Martin looked uncomfortable. The company has been carrying financial obligations beyond normal operations. Dad had told me Brittany was expensive. He had not told me he and Mom were expensive too. We continued. There was a home equity obligation tied indirectly to a personal guarantee Dad had made on another business facility. There were tax balances. There had been distributions during periods when vendor payments were stretched. Some personal expenses had been paid through accounts that were later adjusted by the accountant. None of it, by itself, let me declare a crime. Owners sometimes mix things badly without crossing every legal line imaginable, especially in closely held companies. But financially, the picture was ugly. Dad had treated the company as both business and family reserve. When cash was strong, he pulled money out. When Brittany struggled, he pushed money toward her. When personal obligations came due, he shifted timing. When the company weakened, he borrowed. Then he reached the point where the borrowing needed stronger support. Me, I asked Martin, how long has this been a problem? He looked away from the camera. Define problem. When did you first tell Dad distributions needed to come down because operating cash was getting tight? He was quiet. Martin. Late last year. I wrote it down. Before Mom's renovation? I don't know when the renovation happened. Fair answer. Before the refinance discussion started? Yes. Did distributions come down? Eventually. When? This summer. So after several months. Yes. Did you warn him? I told him we needed to preserve cash. More than once? Yes. Nathan had once told me there was a particular kind of silence I used when someone gave me exactly the answer I feared. He called it my audit silence. I didn't feel powerful in it. I felt disappointed. Martin continued carefully. Morgan, your father wasn't taking money out because he wanted to destroy the company. He thought contracts coming in later this year would normalize things. I believe you. And some of the Brittany-related amounts were expected to come back. I believe that too. He kept thinking the next receivable cycle would fix the imbalance. That sentence gave me the shape of Dad's thinking. Not one enormous theft. A series of temporary decisions. Pull now, replace later. Help Brittany now, collect later. Delay supplier now, catch up later. Borrow now, refinance later. Use Morgan now, explain later. Dad had built an entire financial strategy out of later. I asked Martin to show me the debt service assumptions. The refinance reduced immediate pressure, but the company still needed strong projected revenue to service the new debt while rebuilding working capital. The forecast assumed several major receivables would arrive on time and 2 pending projects would move forward within expected windows. What happens if one of these projects slips? Martin didn't answer immediately. The cushion gets very thin. And 2, we'd need to adjust. Meaning? Cut expenses, slow expansion, possibly sell assets. And if receivables are late again? Same problem. I sat back. This was not a refinance that magically fixed everything. It moved pressure forward. Maybe that could work. Businesses refinance debt all the time. Risk didn't automatically mean recklessness. But Dad wasn't asking me to accept his risk. He had already assigned part of it to me without consent. That was the difference I kept returning to. What does my guarantee change for the lender? I asked. Martin looked uncomfortable again. You should ask them. I know generally. I'm asking why Dad considered it important enough to submit. The company doesn't have enough additional unencumbered collateral to give them the comfort they wanted. And without my guarantee, the terms change. How much? Possibly enough that the transaction doesn't work. There it was. Not emotional. Not complicated. My signature wasn't decorative. It wasn't Dad continuing an old family arrangement. It was one of the things making the new debt possible. After the meeting, I sent my notes to Elena. Then I sat at my desk for a while without opening anything else. Nathan came in carrying 2 sandwiches. You forgot lunch. I didn't forget. I postponed. That's what forgetting looks like when you make spreadsheets. He set one beside me and looked at the legal pad covered in numbers. Is it bad? Worse than Dad said. How much of it is Brittany? Not enough. He pulled out the chair beside me. I turned the pad around. Her studio is part of it. But Dad and Mom have been pulling money out while the company weakened. Some personal obligations are wrapped into the overall pressure. There are tax balances. Other debt. The refinance is trying to stabilize all of it. Nathan looked down the page. So your sister was the explanation. Yes. Not the cause. Not the main one. That mattered more than I expected. For years, whenever my parents asked me to give something up, Brittany had been placed between us. She needs help. She has kids to think about someday. Her business is fragile. She isn't as financially secure as you. Brittany had become the moral reason everyone else used to justify taking from me. Now I was looking at a crisis my parents had largely created themselves. And they had still placed Brittany in front of it. I opened my online banking records that evening. Not because Elena asked me to. Because I wanted to understand something about myself. I searched transfers to my parents and Brittany. At first, the individual payments looked exactly as I remembered them. A tax payment Dad said he'd repay after a customer settled an invoice. A short-term loan when payroll timing went wrong. Money for Brittany's studio security deposit. Part of a vendor bill during a bad quarter. An emergency car repair. Mom said she couldn't put on another card. Nothing had ever felt enormous alone. That was the trick. I created a spreadsheet. Date, amount, reason, repaid, not repaid. Within an hour, I had years of my own history sitting in front of me. Nathan came in but didn't interrupt. I added another transfer, then another. I knew every payment. I remembered every conversation. What I had never done was put them all in one place. When I reached the total, I stared at it. It wasn't enough to bankrupt me. That almost made it worse. My family had always known how much to ask for without making any one request look outrageous. Enough that I could afford it. Not enough that I could justify refusing without sounding selfish. 1,000 here, 5,000 there. A larger emergency loan. A temporary deposit. Something Dad promised to return. Something Mom called a gift to Brittany before I realized I was funding it. I had been financially successful enough that none of them individually changed my life. Together, they changed the story. I scrolled farther down and stopped at one date. My 35th birthday. I remembered that year instantly. Mom had planned dinner with me, then canceled that afternoon because Brittany had a crisis at her studio. I had told her it was fine. Nathan and I weren't engaged yet, so he took me out instead. That same day, Dad had called about a payroll timing problem. I transferred money. I had forgotten that part. Not the transfer. The date. I sat staring at the screen until Nathan finally asked, "What is it?" "Nothing." He waited. I hated that he had learned not to accept that word from me. I pointed at the date. "My birthday." He looked at the transfer. "What happened?" "Mom canceled dinner because Brittany needed her. Dad called because he needed money. I sent it." Nathan sat down. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. I knew every payment. He said nothing. I never knew the total. My throat tightened before I could stop it. I wasn't crying over the money. Money could be replaced. What hit me was the shape of the years. I had thought my family came to me because I was trusted, because I was capable, because Dad respected my judgment, because Mom knew I could handle things. Now I was seeing another possibility. Maybe being the strong one had simply made me the easiest person to bill. Nathan reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. That mattered too. For years, I had treated needing comfort like another invoice I didn't want to send anyone. He asked, "Do you want me to stay?" Yes. So he stayed. We sat there without solving anything. The next morning, Elena called with a question that moved the story again. "Did your father send you any forecast showing what happens if the refinance closes and projected revenue misses?" "Yes. Send me the version he authorized you to receive." I did. She called back later. "There is something I want you to understand before you speak to him again." "What?" "The guarantee isn't merely supplemental comfort." "I know." "No. I mean the risk to you is more concrete than the way they've been describing it." I felt my shoulders tighten. She continued. "The company's available collateral is already heavily committed. If the business underperforms after refinancing, the lender's recovery options would include pursuing guarantors according to the agreement." I know how guarantees work. "Yes. But your father has repeatedly told you nothing could happen to you." I looked at the forecast. He knew the downside. That appears increasingly difficult for him to deny. After we hung up, I reopened Dad's projection. This time, I wasn't looking at revenue. I was looking at the downside cases. The numbers were there. Not hidden. A delayed project. Late receivables. Reduced margins. The same kinds of things that had already happened before. Under those assumptions, company cash tightened again quickly. Dad had seen this forecast. Dad had known. He had not put my name on a loan because he believed risk was impossible. He had put my name on it because if the risk became real, someone else would be standing behind him. I thought back to our conversation in his office. Nothing was ever going to happen to you. It no longer sounded like confidence. It sounded like permission he had given himself. And for the first time since the wedding, I stopped asking whether Dad had crossed a line because he was desperate. I started asking a much harder question. How long had he been planning around the assumption that if his decisions failed, I would be the one left holding them? The question stayed with me because once I asked it, several things I had been treating as separate stopped looking separate. The old guarantee. Dad's insistence that I had always supported the company. His decision to keep distributions flowing while cash tightened. His willingness to let Britney's studio borrow from a business that was already stretching vendors. The new refinance. My name. They were all variations of the same assumption. The next problem could be pushed forward until someone stronger absorbed it. I sent the downside forecast to Elena and asked one narrow question. If Dad had known those numbers, could he reasonably believe the guarantee posed no real risk to me? She called me instead of answering by email. No, she said. Not if we're using no real risk in the way most people understand that phrase. I looked at the spreadsheet on my monitor. Meaning? Every guarantee carries risk, that's why the lender asks for one. But this isn't a healthy company borrowing cheaply against abundant assets with a guarantor added as decoration. The projections you were authorized to review show a company that needs the refinance because existing liquidity is already weak. And if the projections miss, the guarantor exposure becomes more meaningful. How meaningful? That depends on defaults, collateral value, recovery, and the final loan documents. But the agreement bearing your name is written to cover the borrower's obligations under the facility. It isn't capped at the amount you guaranteed years ago. I already knew that. Hearing Elena say it still made my chest tighten. What about the collateral? That's what I want you to be careful with. You don't have the lender's entire collateral file, and neither do I at this stage. Don't assume we know every priority position, so we don't know how exposed I would have been. We know enough to reject your father's claim that nothing could happen to you. That distinction mattered. I wasn't trying to turn uncertainty into the worst possible scenario because the worst possible scenario made Dad look worse. I wanted the opposite. I wanted to remove every exaggeration and see what remained. What remained was bad enough. The guarantee mattered because the company didn't have enough strength on its own. Dad knew that. He had reviewed forecasts, showing the company could tighten again if revenue slipped. He had still told me nothing could happen. After I hung up, I called Martin and asked whether Dad's authorization for the forecast review still covered the supporting debt schedule he'd referenced during our meeting. Martin checked before answering. David told me to show you what you need to understand why the refinance works, he said. That isn't the same as unlimited access. I know. So if something isn't covered, tell me. I will. The next morning we went through the schedule together. I expected another version of what I'd already seen. Instead, I found the first thing that made me understand how little room Dad had actually left himself. Several major business assets were already committed to existing creditors. The receivables supported working capital borrowing. Equipment carried liens. The refinance was designed to pay off some of that debt and replace it with one larger facility. But there wasn't a hidden pile of clean collateral sitting somewhere that could simply be sold if things went badly. Then I saw a note in the downside scenario referring to proceeds from a possible sale of a small warehouse property. What's this? I asked. Martin stopped scrolling. A storage property connected to one of the related entities. Dad owns it? An LLC controlled by your parents owns it. The forecast treats sale proceeds as a backup source. Yes. How much equity is actually available? Martin didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was becoming familiar. How much? I asked again. Less than the gross sale value. I assumed that. The property secures another obligation. I sat back. Another company obligation? Not primarily. I didn't ask him to speculate. Is that reflected in the schedule Dad authorized you to show me? Yes. He opened another page. The warehouse had debt against it already. The remaining equity might still help in a crisis, but nowhere near the amount suggested if someone looked only at market value. So, the downside plan says sell an asset that is already partly spoken for. Martin rubbed his forehead. The plan doesn't say it solves everything, it's one source. I know. I'm trying to understand how many backup plans depend on money that isn't actually free. He gave me a tired look. More than your father likes. That answer sounded less like an accountant and more like a man who had been having the same argument for months. I asked, Did you tell him that? Yes. When? Repeatedly. Before the guarantee was submitted? Yes. I wrote it down. Martin watched me. Morgan, I want to be clear about something. Go ahead. The company isn't fake. I never thought it was. We have real work, real customers, the crews are good, there are jobs in the pipeline. If you looked only at operations, there are reasons to believe the business can survive. But the balance sheet has been carrying decisions the operations didn't make. That sentence was so clean I stopped writing. The business wasn't necessarily dying because nobody wanted flooring. It was struggling because cash generated by the business had been asked to do too many jobs. Support operations. Support dad and mom. Support Brittany. Carry old debt. Catch late customers. Cover new problems. Then borrow enough to pretend all those obligations belonged in one bucket. I asked Martin one final question. If the refinance had closed exactly as proposed, would you have been comfortable? He looked at me through the screen. That's not really my decision, I know. He thought about it. I would have been relieved. That's not the same thing. No. We ended the call there. That afternoon, I drove to the company office because Dad had asked me to sign a receipt acknowledging that Martin had reviewed the authorized financial package with me. Elena had no objection as long as I didn't sign anything beyond receipt of documents, so I went. I hadn't been inside since the confrontation with Dad. The front office looked almost exactly the same. Samples lined one wall. Project binders filled shelves. Someone had left a box of donuts beside the coffee machine. Through the interior windows, I could see employees moving between desks, taking calls, reviewing plans, doing the small repetitive things that make a business real long after owners turn it into an argument. A project manager I'd known for years looked up when I walked past. Morgan, congratulations. It took me half a second to understand. The wedding? I smiled. Thank you. Your dad showed us one picture. That surprised me. Only one? He said you two were keeping things private. Of course he did. The man asked whether Nathan and I were still taking our trip after the wedding. I gave him a vague answer. Then he started telling me about a school renovation his team was preparing for over winter break. He was excited about it, not pretending to be excited for my benefit. He talked about the compressed installation schedule and how much overtime the crew would need. Another employee joined the conversation and complained jokingly that he had already promised his wife he wouldn't spend Christmas week living at a job site. I listened differently than I had before. These weren't Dad's 22 families arranged in a guilt argument. They were people. Some had worked for him longer than Brittany had been an adult. They hadn't signed my name. They hadn't taken a packet from my wedding. They hadn't approved distributions while suppliers waited. They had just shown up for work. Martin came out with the acknowledgement sheet. I read it before signing. He noticed. You really do read everything. My father taught me. The sentence left my mouth before I could stop it. Martin's expression changed. I signed the receipt and handed it back. On the drive home, I thought about what Dad had said. You aren't punishing me. You're destroying 20 families. I had dismissed the phrasing because it was manipulative. The manipulation didn't make the underlying stakes imaginary. If Ellis Commercial Flooring ran out of liquidity and vendors put it on cash-on-delivery terms, projects could stall. If projects stalled, cash tightened further. If the company failed suddenly, employees could lose jobs. Not 22 instant tragedies. Not 22 children standing in the snow because I refused to sign. Reality was less theatrical and more complicated. Some employees would find other work. Some would struggle. Some might lose benefits between jobs. Some projects might transfer to another contractor. Some customers might leave. Dad was wrong to turn all of that into my obligation, but I would have been wrong to pretend none of it mattered because acknowledging it made my decision harder. That evening, Nathan found me at the dining table reading the operational forecast again. He put his keys down. You're considering signing? No. He studied me. You answered fast. Because I'm not considering signing. Then what are you considering? I don't know yet. He sat across from me. I turned the forecast around. This business might actually be salvageable. Your dad's business. The operating business. What's the difference? Maybe a lot. I pointed at the revenue section. They have projects, customers, crews, a backlog. The problem isn't that no one wants what they sell. The capital structure is bad. Cash has been pulled in too many directions. Nathan looked at the page, but didn't pretend to understand all of it. So you think your dad can fix it? No. He looked up. That answer surprised me too. Not because I thought Dad was incapable of running a flooring company. He had spent nearly 30 years proving he could. But the version of Dad I was seeing now had turned every financial problem into an argument for getting one more chance without surrendering control. He wanted the lender to refinance him. He wanted vendors to keep waiting. He wanted me to guarantee him. He wanted Brittany to confirm his story. Every solution preserved the same man in the same chair. What if the company can survive, I said. But not with Dad making every decision. Nathan leaned back. Would he ever agree to that? No? Then why are you thinking about it? Because his employees didn't do this. Nathan was quiet. You know what I'm not going to say? He asked. What? That you don't owe them anything. I don't. I know. He reached across the table. You can care without making yourself collateral. I squeezed his hand. That was the line I needed. For most of my life, my family had treated compassion like a contract. If I cared, I should pay. If I loved someone, I should agree. If I had the capacity to help, refusing became cruelty. I was finally seeing that there could be another option. I could care what happened to Dad's employees without signing a guarantee. I could care whether Brittany lost her business without funding it. I could care whether my parents lost their home without making their debt mine. The fact that I was capable of saving someone did not automatically make me responsible for saving them from the consequences of decisions they had made without me. Elena called the next morning. The Lenders Council wants to schedule a call with us. About what? They're reviewing the disputed guarantee and the representations surrounding it. They're also evaluating what documentation can be relied on if Ellis Commercial Flooring proposes an alternative structure. Alternative structure? Don't get ahead of yourself. That doesn't mean they're offering one. But they're not treating the company as dead. No. A failed closing isn't the same as liquidation. That confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Dad kept presenting the choice as binary. Morgan signs, or everyone loses everything. It wasn't binary. The alternatives might be worse for him. That was different from being impossible. I asked Elena. If they restructure without me, could Dad lose control? Possibly. Depends on the path. Sale, workout, additional capital, asset dispositions, negotiated creditor treatment. We don't know yet. And if somebody buys the operating company? Employees may be retained if the business has going concern value. Again, don't turn a possibility into a plan. I won't. But the idea remained. Save the business without saving Dad's ownership. I could already hear what he would call it. Betrayal. I was beginning to understand that in my family, betrayal often meant refusing to protect someone from a boundary they had crossed. Later that day, Elena forwarded one more set of lender records. Among them was an internal note about the source of the guarantee file. The lender had asked Dad's company to confirm who prepared the guarantor materials because my dispute required them to reconstruct the submission chain. Dad's response tried to put distance between himself and the document. He wrote that administrative staff assembled materials from existing company records. I read that twice. It was technically vague, conveniently vague. So Elena asked the lender to preserve the actual portal history already produced. The timestamps told a cleaner story. Martin's account had uploaded financial schedules. Another staff account had uploaded receivable reports. Dad's authenticated account had uploaded my guarantee. There was no employee account attached to that file. The red herring I'd allowed myself at the beginning was gone completely. No careless accountant. No assistant recycling the wrong attachment. No clerical employee quietly causing a family catastrophe. Dad had submitted it. I couldn't yet prove whose hand or computer created the signature image, but I knew whose credentials placed the document in front of the lender. That night, Mom called. I let it ring once before answering. You need to stop contacting the bank, she said. I haven't contacted a bank. I've responded to a lender about a guarantee in my name. You know what I mean. I usually do. Your father hasn't slept properly in a week. That sounds difficult. She was quiet. Perhaps waiting for the version of me who would immediately ask whether he needed anything. When I didn't, she said, Is that all you have to say? What do you want me to say? That you understand what you're doing to him. I looked out the window. It was already dark, even though it wasn't yet 6. What am I doing, Mom? You're forcing people to question his integrity. No, his actions are doing that. He spent 30 years building a reputation. Then he should have protected it. Her voice sharpened. You sound cruel. I sound finished arguing about whether my reaction is worse than what happened. You think you're the only person who has been hurt? No. What about Brittany? I almost laughed. What about her? She could lose everything she's built. Then maybe she should stop telling lenders I agreed to things I didn't agree to. She is telling them what she remembers. No. She's telling them the version Dad needs. You don't know what she remembers. Neither do you. Mom went silent. I continued. And if you're worried about Brittany, tell her to stop tying herself to Dad's statements. What is that supposed to mean? It means if his story changes again, I wouldn't want her underneath it. There was a beat of silence. Then Mom said something that stayed with me. Your sister understands loyalty. I looked down at the table. There it was again. Not truth. Loyalty. In our family, the two words had become opposites. What does loyalty require this week? I asked. Don't be sarcastic. I'm serious. Your father needs his daughters to stand with him. Even if he's wrong, he was trying to save the family. That isn't an answer. You always have to be right. No, I need my name to be mine. She hung up. The next day, Dad's attorney entered the picture. I learned about it from Elena, not from Dad. He has counsel now, she said. Good. That reaction usually means you're angry. It means he should have counsel. He should. What changed? They sent the lender a proposed chronology. I stopped typing. Of what? Your alleged consent, the wedding weekend verification issue, and the missing packet. My hands went cold. Dad had finally acknowledged the packet. What does he say happened? Elena paused. I knew from the pause that I wasn't going to like the answer. According to the chronology, David did not instruct anyone to access your document case. I stared at the wall. What does he say about Mom? Patricia knew there was a lender package, but supposedly believed you had already agreed to support the transaction. And Brittany? Another pause. He says Brittany independently tried to retrieve the package because she was afraid you would misunderstand it and stop the refinance. For several seconds, I didn't speak. Dad had spent the wedding night telling me I was interrogating my sister. Mom had called the search for my vows a sweet surprise. Brittany had insisted she never saw a bank packet. Now Dad's lawyer was acknowledging that Brittany had taken it. Not only taken it, acted alone. Does Brittany know he submitted this? I asked. I have no idea. What does he say happened to the packet afterward? That Brittany later gave it to him, which means he received property taken from my locked case and never returned it. That's one issue, and he expects everyone to believe she independently knew which lender packet mattered. Independently found the key, independently opened the case, independently removed it, and then independently delivered it to him. I'm telling you what the chronology says. I closed my eyes. For the first time since the wedding, I understood exactly where Dad's strategy was heading. At first, I had been the resource. Then I became the obstacle. Now Brittany was becoming the liability. The golden child wasn't protected anymore. She was useful somewhere else. Elena kept talking about how we should respond. But my phone vibrated against the table. A text appeared from Brittany. Call me. Now. Then another. Please. I stared at the screen. A third message arrived. Dad told them, I opened your case by myself. And just like that, the daughter my parents had spent my whole life protecting finally discovered what their protection was worth when saving her became more expensive than sacrificing her. I called Brittany before I had time to decide whether I wanted to. She answered on the first ring, breathing hard enough that I wondered if she'd been crying or pacing. Dad says opening your case was my idea, she said. I looked at the lender chronology Elena had forwarded me and asked, Was it? Brittany went quiet for several seconds before answering. Opening it was. Knowing what to look for wasn't. That distinction was exactly the kind of thing my family loved. Just enough truth to make a lie easier to carry. I asked where she was, and she said she was sitting in her car outside her studio because she didn't want Mom walking in while we talked. When I told her I wasn't going to have the rest of the conversation over the phone, she immediately asked if she could come to my house. I said no. I wasn't bringing another family crisis into the home. Nathan and I had barely begun building together, and I wasn't interested in meeting at my parents' house where every closed door somehow became somebody else's conversation. Elena offered us a conference room at her office the next morning. I told Brittany she could come, but I also told her something before we hung up. If you're coming because you think I'll protect you from whatever happens next, don't. Brittany whispered my name as though I had misunderstood what she needed, but I didn't let her turn it into another negotiation. I'll listen, I said. I'll tell the truth about anything you do now. I will not promise that telling the truth now erases what you did before. She still came. Brittany looked different without Mom beside her. That may sound strange because she was still my sister, still wearing the same expensive coat she'd worn to family dinners, still carrying the leather bag Dad had bought her for her last birthday. But I had spent so much of our adult lives seeing her as one point in a triangle that I hadn't noticed how much of her confidence depended on knowing our parents were standing behind her. That morning they weren't. She sat across from me at Elena's conference table, with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't touched. And for the first time I could remember, she looked like someone who understood she might have to answer a question without checking which answer Mom wanted. Elena had explained before Brittany arrived that she wasn't Brittany's attorney and wouldn't advise her about her own exposure. If Brittany wanted independent counsel, she should get it. Brittany said she understood, although the way she swallowed afterward told me the word exposure had landed harder than anything I'd said. Then, Elena left us alone for the first conversation, because I wanted to hear my sister's story before it became filtered through the language everyone had learned since the lender put the refinance on hold. I started with the wedding morning. Tell me what happened from the moment Mom took my purse. Brittany stared into her coffee and said Mom hadn't explained anything at first. She had only told Brittany to stay near the bridal suite because Dad was waiting to hear whether something had arrived from the lender. When I asked how Dad knew a verification package existed, Brittany said he could see from the company's closing checklist that guarantor verification had been sent to me and was still outstanding. He couldn't see what I had told the lender, but he knew they had contacted me. That matched what the loan officer had already explained, which was the first reason I kept listening. Brittany said Dad called Mom that morning after the lender's status appeared unchanged. Mom knew the lender's name because she'd seen the envelope when I moved it into the document case. She told him you'd brought bank paperwork to the wedding, Brittany said. He asked what it looked like, and she told him it was the same lender. I asked whether Dad told them what the packet contained, and Brittany shook her head. He said it was verification paperwork that could confuse things if you started reading it before Monday. Confuse things, I repeated. Brittany looked at me. That's what he said. I didn't ask whether she believed him. Not yet. I asked what happened next. Brittany said Mom took my purse before the photographer called me out, opened the zipped pocket, and removed the key. According to Brittany, Mom gave it to her and told her to go into the bridal suite, open the black case, and bring back the bank envelope. Dad had said they needed the packet out of the way until after the weekend because I had supposedly already agreed to support the company and was now becoming nervous because Nathan had been asking questions about family, money. Nathan had never asked Dad a single question about family money before the wedding. The lie was almost elegant because it gave everyone a reason to distrust any objection I made without requiring Nathan to have actually done anything. If I refused, marriage had changed me. If I questioned them, Nathan had planted suspicion. If I produced evidence, I had become cold and legalistic because my husband was pulling me away from the people who loved me first. I asked Brittany whether she believed that explanation when she took the key. She stared at the table for so long that I thought she was going to retreat into, I don't remember. Instead, she said, mostly. I didn't respond, and she corrected herself. I wanted to. That was the first thing she said that morning that sounded less like a defense and more like the beginning of truth. She told me Dad had been saying for months that I had already agreed in principle. He reminded her about the old guarantee and about the birthday dinner, where I said I would look at the numbers if things got bad. Mom kept saying I had always been the practical one and would eventually do what needed to be done. Brittany also admitted Dad had told her I was getting harder to deal with as the wedding approached because Nathan was making me think in terms of his money and my money instead of family. I almost corrected every sentence. I wanted to tell her exactly what I had said at the birthday dinner, exactly what the old guarantee covered, exactly how little Nathan had interfered, but if I turned her confession into another argument about the past, I would lose the part that mattered. So you opened the case, I said. Yes. And you knew you didn't have my permission. Her eyes lifted toward mine. Yes. Keep going. Brittany said the latch stuck when she tried to open it. That detail made my stomach tighten because Nathan and I had joked about the same thing the night before. She turned the key, pulled harder, and eventually got it open. Our passports were on top. Then travel documents and copies of marriage paperwork. The lender envelope was underneath. I knew what Dad wanted, she said. I didn't search through everything. That isn't better. I know. I waited. Then she told me about the page inside. It wasn't the original lender email itself. I had printed the verification notice and a copy of the denial I'd sent because I wanted a paper record with the other documents. Near the front was the line I had written before the wedding. I have not authorized any new guarantee. Please place the transaction on hold pending verification. Brittany read it. I asked her to say that again. She looked directly at me this time. I read it. That was the point where the story stopped being about what Dad had told her. I asked, "Did you understand what it meant?" "Yes." "Did you think I had agreed after you read that?" She shook her head. "Did you still take the packet?" Her voice came out quieter. "Yes." I leaned back and looked at her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I had imagined that scene so many times since the wedding that hearing the truth should have felt satisfying. It didn't. I had wanted some hidden explanation that would make the photograph less personal. Instead, my sister had stood beside the dress I'd chosen for my wedding, opened a locked case with a key taken from my purse, read a statement in which I explicitly denied authorizing a financial obligation, and still decided the correct person to protect was Dad. Brittany told me she stood there longer than Mom expected. According to her, she had actually thought about coming to find me. She said she could hear voices in the hallway and remembered hearing me laugh with one of my bridesmaids. I didn't remember that moment, and I didn't pretend I did. That was Brittany's recollection, not mine. She said Mom came into the suite and asked, "Did you get it?" Brittany showed her the denial page and said, "Morgan says she didn't agree." Mom looked at it, then told her Dad already knew I was panicking and that this was exactly why he didn't want me reading the lender material before the wedding. Brittany said she asked whether they should talk to me, and Mom told her there was nothing to discuss because your father has already handled it. "And then?" I asked. I gave her the packet. "You closed the case?" "Yes." "You locked it?" "Yes." "And you gave Mom the key back?" "Yes." The photograph our cousin took came shortly afterward. Brittany said she hadn't realized the case was still open when our cousin entered because she'd been putting on earrings, and Mom had stepped away with the envelope. The cousin asked for a picture. Brittany smiled. And neither of them noticed that the black case behind her would eventually become the one object in the entire replacement slideshow my parents couldn't talk their way around. I asked her about the fake vows story. Mom came up with that after Nathan saw the picture. "Before you came into the lounge?" "Yes." "So when you told me Mom wanted my vows, you knew that wasn't true?" "Yes." "And when I asked where the bank packet was?" I lied. "You said you'd never seen one." "I know." I let her hear the silence after that. Then Brittany started crying. Not loudly. There was no collapse, no performance. Tears simply ran down her face while she stared at the coffee cup between her hands. "I thought Dad would fix it," she said. I felt something in me harden. Not because she was crying, but because of the sentence. "Fix what?" "Everything." "No, say what you mean." She wiped her face. "The refinance, the business, the signature. I thought once the company stabilized, he'd explain it to you and you'd be furious, but nothing would actually happen. That was worth risking my name? You had more room than any of us." There it was, the family equation in its purest form. I didn't raise my voice. "More room for what?" "To recover. If the company failed, you had savings. Your job, your house, Nathan." She stopped as soon as she heard herself. I had spent days analyzing loan covenants and collateral schedules, but Brittany had just explained the emotional math more clearly than any spreadsheet. I had more, therefore losing something would hurt me less. Brittany had less, therefore anything she wanted mattered more. Dad had a company, therefore saving it justified risk. Mom had a lifestyle and a house, therefore protecting them counted as family survival. My stability wasn't mine. It was unused capacity. I said, that was Mom's math. Brittany wiped her cheek again. And you decided to use it too. She looked away. For several minutes, we didn't discuss the loan at all. Instead, Brittany said something I wasn't expecting. Do you know what it was like growing up next to you? I almost laughed because the timing felt absurd. She continued before I could answer. You were good at everything that mattered outside our house. School, college, work. Dad bragged about your job even when he was mad at you. People listened to you. You walked into a room like you knew what you were doing. You think I felt that way? I know you didn't always. I'm telling you what it looked like from where I was. I let her continue. Mom always said I needed more help. Dad always said you were going to be fine. So, yeah, I liked being the one they chose. You had everything else. The sentence should have made me furious. Instead, it made something painfully simple. Brittany had understood the same family structure I had. She had simply benefited from the opposite side of it. You thought I had the outside world? I said. So Mom and Dad could belong more to you. Her face crumpled slightly. Maybe. And when that meant they gave you money, protected your mistakes, or asked me to give something up, I told myself you could handle it. That's not the same as it being fair. I know that now. No, you know what it feels like now that they're doing it to you. She flinched. I didn't regret saying it. There was an important difference between recognizing harm because your conscience changed and recognizing it because the machine finally turned in your direction. Brittany reached into her bag and took out her phone. I have something. My body went still. Show me. She opened a family group thread I hadn't seen. It wasn't our normal family chat. Dad had created it during the refinance and used Mom and Brittany's personal numbers. My name was not included. Brittany scrolled back to the Friday before the wedding. Dad. Closing checklist says Morgan's guarantor verification was dispatched. Then Mom, wedding morning. I saw the lender envelope in her case. Her purse is with me. Dad. Get the bank packet from the case before Monday. Brittany. What if she notices? Mom. Not tonight. She'll be too busy. I read those messages once without touching the phone. Then I said, keep going. Brittany scrolled. A message from her appeared after the time the photo had been taken. She definitely said no. Dad replied less than 2 minutes later. I know. I stared at those 2 words. Not I think she's confused. Not she already agreed. Not call me. I know. Then came another message from Brittany. What do you want me to do with this? Dad answered. Bring me everything. For the first time since the forged-looking guarantee appeared, I stopped feeling uncertain about whether Dad had convinced himself I had agreed. He knew I had said no before the planned closing. He knew it in writing. And after Brittany told him she had found my denial inside a locked case, he still told her to bring him the packet. I looked at my sister. You had this the entire time. Yes. While Dad told the lender I'd orally agreed. Yes. While Mom showed relatives that cropped screenshot. Yes. While you told me Dad was just trying to save the company. Yes. She didn't defend herself now. That helped, but not nearly enough. I asked why she hadn't shown me sooner. Because if I did, Dad was finished. There was the old reflex again. Protect the person who created the danger. I said. And now? Now he's telling his lawyer I acted alone. The answer was so painfully honest that I almost admired it. Not conscience first. Self-preservation first. The difference was that self-preservation had finally pushed Brittany toward the truth instead of away from it. She unlocked the phone again. If I give this to your lawyer and the lender, will you tell them I helped? I looked at her for a long moment. There were a dozen responses I could have given if I wanted revenge. I could have told her she deserved whatever happened. I could have made cooperation conditional on an apology. I could have promised to protect her, becoming the new person she ran to whenever Dad stopped solving her problems. I did none of those things. I'll tell them exactly when you helped, I said. And exactly when you didn't. She closed her eyes. That's fair. It isn't about fair. What is it about? The truth. She gave a small, miserable laugh. You really do make everything that simple. No. You all made it complicated. Brittany asked if she should send screenshots. I told her not to touch anything until Elena came back in. When Elena returned, Brittany explained what the thread was and showed her the phone. Elena immediately told her the messages needed to be preserved properly, not just cropped into screenshots. She also repeated that Brittany should consider getting her own attorney before making formal statements because cooperating did not erase the fact that she had entered my case and removed the packet. Brittany looked at me when Elena said it. I didn't rescue her. That may sound small, but it was one of the hardest things I had done. For years, the family had trained me to react to Brittany's fear as if fear itself created an obligation. She was afraid, therefore I should soften. She was overwhelmed, therefore I should solve. She was in trouble, therefore the person who could handle more should carry more. I let her sit with the consequence instead. Then her phone rang. Mom? Brittany stared at the name and asked, "Should I answer?" I said, "That's your decision." She looked surprised. I meant it. If I told her to answer, I became the director of her confession. If I told her not to, I became her protector. She needed to make one choice without looking across the room to see which person would approve it. Brittany answered. She didn't put Mom on speaker at first, but the conference room was quiet enough that I could hear the rhythm of Mom's voice without making out every word. Brittany listened, said almost nothing, then glanced at me and turned the volume up slightly after asking Mom to repeat herself. Mom's voice came through clearly enough then. Your father needs you to stay consistent. Brittany's fingers tightened around the phone. Consistent with what? With what happened? Which version? Mom paused. Don't do this. Dad told his lawyer I opened Morgan's case by myself. You did open it. You gave me the key. That isn't the point. It feels like the point. Mom lowered her voice. Brittany, listen to me. Your father is trying to protect the company. If you start changing your story now, you could destroy everything. Brittany looked at me. I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I kept my hands flat on the table. Mom continued. You panicked because you thought Morgan would misunderstand the lender packet. You acted before thinking it through. We can deal with that. But if you start saying your father ordered you to do it, this becomes something much worse. Brittany swallowed. He did tell me to get it. Not like you're making it sound. He wrote it. Silence. Mom's voice changed. What have you shown Morgan? Brittany's eyes filled again. Mom, what have you shown her? The messages. I heard Mom inhale sharply. Then came the sentence that finally broke whatever Brittany had been trying to preserve. Do you have any idea what you've done to your father? Not what your father did to Morgan. Not what we asked you to do. Not why were you the one opening your sister's locked case on her wedding day. What you've done to your father. Brittany stared at the table. Mom said her name again, sharper this time. You need to tell Morgan you were scared and acted on your own. Your father cannot lose everything because you panicked. I watched Brittany's expression change. I'd seen the beginning of it when she called me the night before. Now I saw the rest. For most of her life, my sister had believed being chosen by our parents meant being protected by them. She was finally learning that protection was conditional too. They would protect Brittany as long as protecting Brittany preserved the system. Now the safest version for Dad required sacrificing her. Mom was willing to do it. Brittany said, no. Mom went silent. Brittany's voice shook, but she repeated it. No, I'm not saying I acted alone. Your father, I know what Dad needs. Then why are you doing this? Brittany looked at me for half a second before answering. Because Morgan said no before I took the packet, and I knew it. Mom didn't respond immediately. When she finally did, her voice had gone cold. You're making a very serious mistake. Maybe, after everything we've done for you. There it was. The invoice. Eventually, everybody in my family received one. Brittany whispered, I have to go, and ended the call. She put the phone face down and started crying again. This time I didn't feel vindicated. For years, there had been a part of me that wanted Brittany to understand. I had imagined some future argument where she would finally see the favoritism, finally acknowledge that being the strong daughter didn't mean I had been loved equally. Finally feel what it was like when mom and dad chose somebody else's comfort over yours. I hadn't understood that the only way Brittany might truly understand was for them to hurt her too. I didn't enjoy watching it happen. But I also didn't move around the table to comfort her. Both things could be true. You should get your own lawyer, I said. She laughed through the tears. That's what you have to say? Yes. I just told mom no for probably the first time in my life. I heard you. And you should still get your own lawyer. She looked at me for a long moment. Then, strangely, she nodded. Okay. By late afternoon, Elena had arranged for Brittany to preserve the full message thread and provide it through the proper channel. Brittany also agreed that the Lenders' Council could receive the relevant communications once her own representation was sorted out. Nobody promised her immunity from consequences. Nobody told her she had fixed what she'd done. Before she left, Brittany stopped at the conference room door. Do you hate me? I thought about the old picture under our parents' dining table. Two girls squeezed together in a place barely large enough for both of them. I thought about the college calls, the cheap champagne, the years when she had been my sister before she became the person my parents placed between me and every demand. Then I thought about the packet. I don't know what our relationship is after this, I said. That's the truth. She nodded. I continued before she could leave. Dad lied to you. I know, but then you found out. Her face tightened. You kept going. I know. Don't lose that part just because he's blaming you now. She looked down. I won't. I hoped she meant it. A few hours later, after Nathan and I had eaten dinner without discussing my family for the first 10 minutes because we were trying to remember what normal marriage felt like, my phone buzzed. Dad. It was the first written message he'd sent me in days. We need to talk before your sister ruins this family. I read it twice. Then I handed the phone to Nathan. He looked at the message and gave it back without saying anything. For weeks, Dad had been given opportunity after opportunity to identify what had gone wrong. The unauthorized guarantee, the missing packet, the false lender statements, the cropped family story, the attempt to leave Brittany holding the blame. And after all of it, he still thought the person ruining the family was the one who had finally stopped protecting the lie. Brittany's cooperation changed the shape of the dispute, but I made a point of not turning her into my witness. She hired her own attorney within 2 days. After that, I was not present for every conversation she had with the Lenders' Council, and I did not ask Elena to tell me every detail. The messages from the family thread were preserved properly, their metadata retained, and the relevant portions were provided through the appropriate channels. That was enough for me. I had spent too much of my life inside a family where one person always explained what everyone else meant. I wasn't going to replace Mom as the person managing everybody's version of reality. Dad knew the messages existed almost immediately. I didn't know whether Brittany told him directly or his attorney learned through the lender's process, and I didn't need to know. What mattered was that the tone of his messages changed again. He stopped calling me disloyal. He stopped talking about Nathan. He stopped insisting the wedding packet had been a misunderstanding. Instead, he sent one short email asking to meet me alone. Elena recommended her office. Dad objected at first. This is between a father and his daughter, he said on the phone. It stopped being only that when my name went into a lender file. He was quiet. Then he agreed. He arrived 10 minutes early wearing a suit, even though the meeting had nothing formal about it. Dad had always dressed carefully when he wanted to feel in control. I noticed things like that now, not because they were evidence of anything, but because I had finally stopped confusing presentation with certainty. Elena offered to sit in. I told her I wanted the first part alone as long as Dad agreed. She stayed nearby. He and I sat across from each other at a conference table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Dad said, Brittany is destroying her own life. I had expected him to start with the company. I hadn't expected him to start by blaming her. She told the truth about the messages. She panicked. She read my written denial before taking the packet. She was under pressure. From whom? He looked at me. I waited. Dad folded his hands on the table. Do you have any idea what happens if the lender walks away completely? We've discussed that. No, we've discussed numbers. I'm asking whether you understand what it means. I built that company from nothing. I have employees who have been with me 20 years. Customers who trusted my name before anyone knew yours. There was something painful in hearing that because all of it was true. Dad had built something real. That was why losing it frightened him. It was also why he had convinced himself other people's boundaries became negotiable when his work was threatened. I understand what the company means to you, I said. Then act like it. I looked at him. That was still his answer. Not I was wrong. Not I shouldn't have done it. Act like you understand. Meaning save me. I said, tell the lender the truth before Brittany has to prove it for you. His face became still. What truth? That I never approved the guarantee. That you knew I had denied it before closing. That you told Mom and Brittany to retrieve the verification packet because you wanted to get through the weekend without me stopping the transaction. His jaw tightened. You're asking me to confess to your version. No, I'm asking you to correct yours. He leaned back. And then what? What do you mean? If I do that? If I go in there and say everything the way you want me to say it, then what? I knew where he was going before he finished. He asked, will you help me save the company? No. The answer came easily. Dad stared at me. I continued. Telling the truth isn't something you trade for rescue. So you want me to destroy myself for nothing. I almost couldn't believe he'd said it that plainly. For nothing? You know what I mean. No. I think I finally do. He stood and walked toward the window. I could lose the company. Yes. Your mother and I could lose the house. I know. Brittany's business is already hanging by a thread. I know that too. And you're asking me to walk into the lender and give them ammunition? I'm asking you to stop making your survival dependent on somebody else carrying your lie. He turned around. You really have changed. There was a time when that sentence would have frightened me. I would have searched his face for the daughter he wanted back. Instead, I asked, changed from what? He didn't answer. That was when I understood something I should have seen earlier. Dad did not want forgiveness if forgiveness didn't include restoration. He didn't want to admit what he had done, and then accept whatever followed. He wanted a deal in which truth became another asset he could exchange. He would apologize if apology refinanced the company. He would confess if confession bought my signature. Without rescue attached, honesty had no value to him. Dad returned to the table. I did everything I did to protect this family. Did you? Yes. You put me on debt I didn't agree to. Because I knew you could handle it. The words were so close to Brittany's that I felt almost numb. Dad continued. You have a good career. Savings. Property. Nathan has a stable income. You were never going to be ruined. And that made it acceptable? It made the risk manageable. For you. He exhaled sharply. For everyone. I looked down at my hands. Then I remembered being 16. A yellow legal pad. A bank statement. Dad tapping a pen against the table, while I pretended not to listen. My name was worth more than anything I owned. He frowned. You taught me that. For the first time in the meeting, he had nothing ready. I continued quietly. Never sign something you haven't read. Friendship doesn't make unread paperwork safe. Remember? His face changed. He remembered. I didn't need him to admit it. You taught me those things, I said. Then when respecting them became inconvenient, you decided they only applied when the signature wasn't mine. Dad looked away. I could have kept going. I didn't. Some truths become weaker when you explain them too long. Before he left, he tried one more time. If the company goes, this family will never be the same. I stood. It already isn't. That afternoon, Mom called asking to see me. I nearly refused, but there was one question I wanted her to answer without Dad beside her. We met at a coffee shop near her house. She chose a table in the back and spent the first several minutes complaining that people were treating her like she'd committed some terrible crime just because she'd held my purse at my wedding. I let her finish. Then I asked, Are you really going to let Dad say Brittany acted alone? Mom's expression changed immediately. This is complicated. No, that part isn't. Brittany did open your case. You gave her the key. She made choices too. I know. Mom looked almost relieved that I agreed. I wasn't finished. She made choices, Dad made choices, you made choices. I'm asking about yours. What do you want me to say? That when Dad decided the safest version was blaming Brittany, you stopped protecting her. Mom stared at me. Your father cannot lose everything. There it was. I asked. So Brittany can? That's not what I said. It's exactly what you're doing. She isn't innocent. I know that better than you think. Then why are you defending her? I am not defending her. I'm asking why the daughter you spent my whole life telling me needed more protection suddenly doesn't qualify for it. Mom's face tightened. You always resented what we did for your sister. That isn't an answer. She needed us. And now? She made a terrible mistake. So now Dad needs you more. Mom looked away. That was enough. For years, I'd treated Mom's favoritism as if Brittany occupied a permanent place in her heart that I could never reach. The truth was colder. Brittany had occupied a useful place in the family hierarchy. She was protected because she was fragile. Her dependency gave Mom purpose. Her loyalty reinforced Dad's authority. Her mistakes justified everyone else's rescue. But the moment protecting Brittany threatened Dad's company, Dad's reputation, and the financial structure Mom depended on, the hierarchy changed. Brittany wasn't sacred. Nobody was. We were roles. And roles changed depending on what the system needed. I left before Mom could turn the conversation into another story about my jealousy. A week later, Elena called to tell me the lender's workout team had begun discussing alternatives with Dad's advisors. A regional flooring company had expressed interest in acquiring the operating business or substantial operating assets if the numbers held up. It wasn't an offer yet, and Elena warned me not to treat it like one. But the concept was real enough to explain why Dad suddenly became more desperate. A buyer could keep customer contracts, crews, equipment they actually needed, and much of the operational value intact. It could also remove Dad. That was the part he couldn't tolerate. 3 days later, Dad sent me a proposal. Not through Elena. Directly. He wanted me to provide fresh capital and sign a new, properly documented limited guarantee. In exchange, he would transfer a significant equity stake to me and give me enough governance rights that I could effectively control major financial decisions going forward. I read it twice. Then I sent it to Elena. Nathan came home while I was still sitting at the dining table. What happened? My father offered me the company. Nathan raised an eyebrow. The whole thing? Not exactly. I explained. If I put real money in and agreed to new exposure, Dad would dilute himself enough to give me meaningful control. The company would remain in the family. He would stay involved operationally, at least initially, but I would have veto rights over major borrowing and distributions. Nathan listened. And is that a good deal? Financially? Yes. I don't know yet. That wasn't the question I meant. I looked at him. He pulled out the chair across from me. Do you actually want the company? The question annoyed me because I hadn't asked it myself. I looked back at Dad's proposal. For a few seconds, I let myself imagine it. My name on the office. Dad forced to ask my approval before borrowing. No more distributions without controls. No more related party advances to Brittany because Mom said she needed them. No more speeches about how I didn't understand what it took to run something. There was a version of revenge in that picture that felt almost elegant. Dad feared losing control. I could take it, not steal it, not trick him. He was offering. I could sit in the chair he'd spent 30 years defending and make every rule he'd ignored. Then Nathan asked again, more gently, "Do you want it?" And the fantasy collapsed. No. He didn't smile. He waited. I don't want to run a flooring company. Okay. I don't want to spend the next 10 years fixing what he did. Okay. I don't want my savings tied to whether contractors pay on time. Nathan nodded. I stared at the proposal. I've spent years helping keep that company alive, and I never once asked myself whether I wanted any part of it. Because everyone else assumed you did? Because they assumed if I cared about Dad, I cared about the company the same way he did. I closed the document. I don't. That realization gave me more relief than winning control ever could. If I accepted Dad's proposal, I might own more. But I would still be doing exactly what the family had always expected. Putting my money behind their decisions. Turning competence into responsibility. Using my stability to absorb instability they created. Only this time I would receive stock certificates for it. That wasn't freedom. It was a better seat at the same table. I told Elena the next morning that I would not provide new capital, would not sign a replacement guarantee, and did not want an equity for rescue arrangement. She asked once whether I wanted an independent financial review before making the decision. No. Because? Because even if it's a profitable investment, I don't want it. She paused. That's a good enough reason. Dad called within an hour of learning my answer. You didn't even negotiate. There was nothing I wanted. You want to let a competitor take this company? I want the company to survive if it can, under somebody else. If that's the viable option. His voice rose. You'd rather strangers own what your family built than step up yourself. There was a time when those words would have worked. I would have felt the weight of all the people who came before me. Dad's late nights. Mom answering phones when the company was small. The office where Brittany and I did homework. Family dinners interrupted by project emergencies. But memory wasn't an invoice either. I don't want the company, I said. You don't know what you want. I do. You're angry. Yes. At least admit that's what this is. I'm angry enough that taking control from you sounded good for about 5 minutes. He went silent. I continued. Then I realized owning your company would still mean letting it control my life. This is your legacy too. No, it's yours. He hung up. The Lenders' Council formally notified Elena later that week that concerns surrounding the disputed guarantee and related representations had been referred through the appropriate legal channels. Elena warned me again that referral did not mean arrest, conviction, or even a guarantee of charges. It meant the evidence would no longer stay entirely inside a commercial workout. I understood. By then, I didn't need a dramatic arrest. The thing Dad had been trying to prevent was already happening. Other people were reviewing his decisions without accepting his explanations at face value. The final workout meeting was scheduled for the following week. The purpose was practical. Review the restructuring path, clarify whether any deal still depended on me, and determine what the lender and company would do next. The prospective buyer's outline required Dad to leave management if the transaction moved forward. That condition terrified him more than the price. The night before the meeting, Brittany sent me one message. I told them everything I remembered. My lawyer was there. I replied, "Thank you for telling the truth." I didn't write, "I forgive you." She didn't ask. A few minutes later, Dad texted, "When they ask you tomorrow, remember who built all of this." I looked at the words for a long time. Then I locked my phone and put it face down on the table. Nathan was making coffee for the morning, even though it was almost 10 at night. He glanced at me but didn't ask what Dad had said. He didn't need to. For months, my father had believed the final question would be whether I cared enough about him to save what he built. By then, I understood the real question. Whether caring about someone required me to become responsible for everything they refused to lose. I already knew my answer before I walked into that meeting. The workout meeting took place in a conference room that looked almost aggressively ordinary for something my father had spent months treating like the end of the world. Gray carpet. Water bottles. A tray of coffee. No one touched. The lender's workout team sat on one side of the table with counsel. Dad and his attorney sat across from them. Mom was beside him, even though she had no formal role in the company. Brittany came with her own attorney and chose a chair near the end rather than beside our parents. Elena sat next to me. Nathan wasn't there because I had asked him not to come. I wanted the answer I gave that day to belong entirely to me. The prospective buyer had submitted enough information that the lender was willing to continue discussing a going concern sale rather than force a chaotic shutdown. The operating company still had value. Customer relationships mattered. The backlog mattered. The experienced crews mattered. Several projects could move forward under new ownership if the transition happened quickly enough. That should have been good news. Dad treated it like an insult. "They're stealing a company at a distressed price," he said. The lender's representative, a woman named Karen Holt, answered calmly. "No transaction has been approved. We're discussing options available under the current circumstances. The circumstances you created when you froze my refinance." Nobody responded immediately. I almost admired his ability to reach that sentence without acknowledging why the refinance had been frozen. Karen looked at her notes. The refinance was placed on hold after the proposed guarantor disputed authorization. Dad looked at me. I didn't look away. His attorney touched his arm lightly, but Dad kept going. My daughter has supported this company before. Elena shifted beside me. I knew she would step in if he tried to turn the room into another argument about the old guarantee. But Karen didn't give him the opportunity. We have reviewed the prior facility, she said. That guarantee was limited and released. Mom moved in her chair. Dad said, there were subsequent family understandings. Karen's expression didn't change. The lender has received information concerning those representations as well. Brittany looked down at the table. For the first time, Dad seemed to notice how little control he had over which version of events entered the room. He turned toward me. Morgan, tell them you are willing to help. There it was. Not that I had signed. Not that I had agreed to the actual loan. Willing to help. A phrase broad enough to carry almost anything if everyone in the room agreed not to examine it. I said, I was willing to review requests for help. I did not authorize the guarantee. Dad's attorney spoke quietly to him again. This time he listened. The meeting moved back to numbers. The lender reviewed the company's current liquidity, vendor pressure, debt position, and the prospective buyer's preliminary terms. The buyer was interested in the operating assets, certain contracts, inventory, equipment, and retaining most of the workforce. Final retention would depend on project needs and due diligence, but the proposal was clearly designed to preserve the viable part of the business rather than liquidate everything piece by piece. There was one major condition. Dad would not remain in management. He knew it already. Hearing it spoken aloud still changed his face. Karen said, the proposed buyer is not willing to proceed with existing senior management remaining in operational control. Dad leaned forward. I've run this company for almost 30 years. I understand. You think someone can walk in here and run my crews better than I can? This is not an evaluation of your flooring expertise. It sounds like one. His attorney intervened before the exchange became worse. I watched Dad and understood why he had been willing to risk so much. The company wasn't just where he worked. It was where his authority became visible. At home, he was a husband and father. Inside Ellis Commercial Flooring, people waited for his decisions. Banks called him. Vendors negotiated with him. Employees came into his office asking what to do. If the company continued without him, he wouldn't merely lose money. He would be forced to see that the thing he built could survive after he stopped controlling it. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then Karen reached the question I had known was coming. She looked at me. Miss Ellis, I want the record to be completely clear. Are you willing today to provide a new guarantee, reaffirm the disputed guarantee, or otherwise pledge personal assets in support of a restructuring for Ellis Commercial Flooring? The room went silent. Dad looked at me. Mom looked at me. Brittany did too. For most of my life, questions like that had never sounded like questions. Can you help your sister? Can you cover this temporarily? Can you give Dad a little breathing room? Can you understand what the family needs? They were requests in grammar only. The expected answer had always been yes. I looked at Karen. No. Dad shifted immediately. Karen continued. To confirm, you are not willing to reaffirm the guarantee currently under dispute. No. Nor provide a replacement guarantee? No. Nor contribute new capital? No. She nodded and wrote something down. That should have been the end of it. Dad made sure it wasn't. After everything we put into you, his attorney said, David. Dad ignored him. You sit there because we gave you every opportunity. We paid for things when you were young. We supported you. We helped you become whatever this is. I felt strangely calm. What do you mean by whatever this is? This. He gestured toward Elena, the lender, the documents. Acting like we're strangers. You mean asking before you use my name? I mean pretending family doesn't owe family anything. I looked at him. You mean everything you expected back? His face reddened. You have the money. The room became very still. I said, that never made it yours. His attorney closed his eyes for half a second. Mom whispered, Morgan. I turned toward her. She looked devastated, but I no longer knew which loss she was grieving. Dad's company, their house, Brittany's future, the family image, maybe all of it. You could stop this, she said. No, people are going to lose things. I know. How can you live with that? I thought about the question before answering because I didn't want anger to choose the words. By knowing I didn't create the debts, the false statements, or the missing packet. And by knowing there is a path that may preserve the company without making me responsible for all of them. Dad laughed bitterly. Preserve the company? They want to take it from me. I looked at him. The company and your ownership are not the same thing. That was the sentence he couldn't accept. The meeting ended without a dramatic declaration. There was no gavel, no police officer waiting outside. No lender representative announcing that Dad had lost everything. Real consequences were slower. The workout process continued. The buyer completed more due diligence. Terms changed. Creditors negotiated. Some contracts required consent to transfer. Vendors had to decide whether to continue supplying the business. Employees spent weeks hearing rumors before anyone could tell them what was actually happening. I hated that part. I couldn't promise them security. Neither could Dad. Eventually, the operating business was sold. Most of the field crews and several office employees were retained. Not everyone stayed. A few people left before the deal closed because they found other jobs. One administrative position disappeared in the consolidation. But Ellis Commercial Flooring did not collapse overnight into an empty building. It continued, just without Dad. The buyer removed his name from management immediately. He was not retained as a consultant. He was not given an honorary title. The office where I had done homework as a child became someone else's office. Dad had spent months telling me that refusing to guarantee him meant destroying 22 jobs. In the end, the path that preserved most of those jobs was the one thing he had refused to consider because it did not preserve him. Mom and Dad sold their house the following spring. I heard about it from Aunt Diane, not from Mom. The sale was not some dramatic foreclosure scene. They had equity, but they also had obligations I had not understood until the refinance dispute exposed how interconnected their finances had become. They moved into a smaller house outside the neighborhood where Mom had spent years hosting family holidays and talking about property values as though they reflected character. Several relatives still believed I had been unnecessarily harsh. That mattered less than I expected. Others quietly changed their position after the full family messages circulated through the legal process and Mom's cropped screenshot became harder to defend. Aunt Diane called me once and said, "I wish I'd asked you before repeating some of what your mother said," I answered. "I wish you had too." I didn't make her apologize for 10 minutes. I also didn't tell her it was fine. Some things weren't fine just because the person finally admitted them. Brittany lost her studio within a few months. Not because I made a call, not because I exposed her to clients. The business had been more dependent on family support than she'd admitted, and once Dad could no longer subsidize vendor payments and Mom couldn't keep filling gaps, the numbers stopped pretending. The buyer that took over Dad's company interviewed Brittany for a legitimate role because she had some useful client and design experience. It wasn't the management position Dad had promised her. It wasn't a title created around being the owner's daughter. It was a mid-level client services position. Brittany turned it down. For several weeks I thought that meant she had learned nothing. Then she took a job at another design firm. Not as an owner. Not as a director. An ordinary salaried job with a manager she couldn't call Dad when she disagreed. We did not become close again. She sent me one message several months later saying she had started repaying one of the old amounts I'd lent her. The payment was small. I didn't tell her not to bother. I also didn't treat it as forgiveness. She had finally started doing something our family had rarely required from her, paying the cost of her own decisions. The lender referred the guarantee matter and related representations through the appropriate legal channels. I was interviewed. Brittany was interviewed with her attorney. Company records were reviewed. The authenticated portal history, the old released guarantee, my old email requiring future consent, the lender correspondence, my pre-closing denial, and the family message thread all became parts of a much larger record. Nothing happened overnight. Dad wasn't arrested in a restaurant while everyone applauded. Months passed. Eventually, he resolved the criminal case through a plea agreement tied to the false financial documentation and related conduct. Elena warned me from the beginning not to predict punishment, and I didn't. The final consequences included financial penalties, legal costs, obligations tied to actual provable losses and expenses, and restrictions that made returning to the kind of business control he'd once had extremely difficult. By then, losing the company had already punished him in the place that mattered most. He could no longer tell himself he had done everything to preserve his legacy. His decisions were the reason he no longer controlled it. Mom blamed Brittany for months. Then she blamed me. Then Nathan. Then Dad's accountant. Then the lender. I don't know whether she ever reached herself. I stopped waiting for it. That may have been the biggest change in me. For years, I thought boundaries worked when the other person finally understood them. If I explained clearly enough, Mom would see why something hurt. If I showed Dad enough numbers, he would respect the limit. If Brittany saw enough evidence, she would admit the favoritism. I had treated understanding as the final stage of every conflict. Now I knew better. My parents understood my boundaries. They simply disagreed that those boundaries should matter when they wanted something badly enough. That was not confusion I could solve. It was a choice I could stop participating in. By the time Nathan and I finally took the trip we had postponed after the wedding, the marriage felt less like the beginning of a new family and more like the first time I understood what having one could mean. Nathan never asked me to forgive my parents. He never asked me to cut them off permanently either. He let me decide what access looked like. For a while, it looked like very little. Then one afternoon, months after everything settled, our wedding photographer delivered the final album. I had almost forgotten about it. Nathan and I sat together on the couch and went through the photographs slowly. There were pictures of us laughing before the ceremony, his mother fixing his boutonniere, my friends helping with my dress, the ceremony, the first dance, the cake. Then I started noticing Mom. Not because she was doing anything dramatic, because of where she was looking. In photograph after photograph, even during moments centered on me, her attention drifted toward Brittany. When Nathan and I entered the reception, Mom was turned toward my sister. During the cake cutting, she was watching Brittany laugh at something. In one wide photograph taken while I was dancing, Mom had one hand on Brittany's arm. Years earlier, those images would have broken me. This time, they clarified something. I didn't need to delete them. I didn't need to prove she had loved Brittany more. I didn't need a jury. I knew what the pattern had cost me. That was enough. Near the back of the album was the childhood picture Nathan and I had originally chosen for the slideshow. Brittany and me under our parents' dining table, both laughing. The photographer had included it because it had been part of the original file we gave the venue. I looked at it for a long time. Nathan asked, "Do you want it in the album?" "Yes." He seemed surprised. I touched the edge of the photograph. That happened too. Brittany had been my sister before she became my parents' shield. Dad had taught me good things before he violated them. Mom had loved me in ways that did not excuse the ways she used me. I didn't need to rewrite my childhood to justify what I did as an adult. I only needed to stop letting the past grant unlimited access to my future. When we finished, I took the album upstairs. The black document case was still in the closet. Nathan had offered to throw it away after everything happened. I kept it. I had replaced the sticking latch and installed a new lock. Inside were our passports, important records, and the paperwork from the case that had finally ended. I placed the wedding album on top. Then I closed the lid. The lock clicked cleanly this time. I put the key in my own desk drawer and stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the case. My family had spent years treating my money, my competence, my credit, and eventually even my name as resources available whenever they needed them. They had called that love. I didn't anymore. I could love people without financing them. I could care about what happened to them without preventing every consequence. I could forgive things someday without restoring access. And being strong enough to save someone did not mean I had to save them from choices they knowingly made. For the first time in my life, the line around what belonged to me no longer felt like something I needed my family to approve. It was simply mine. You can love your family without surrendering your money, credit, privacy, or future. When someone crosses a clear boundary, document what happened, protect yourself, and let consequences belong to the person who caused them. If you value stories about accountability and self-respect, subscribe and stay with us for more stories.